Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Story 1. 1. I noticed the same man appearing in the background of multiple photos I had taken over several months. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, a passerby who happened to be in the frame each time I took a picture. But as I scrolled through my phone, checking photos from different locations and different times, I began to notice a pattern. The same man, dressed in a dark jacket and a hat, always in the background, always standing just far enough away to make it look like a chance encounter. It was unsettling. He wasn't close enough to be a part of the moment, but he was always there, lurking in the corners of my memories. I couldn't remember seeing him in person. I had no recollection of any man matching his description, and yet there he was, clear as day in every photo. He wasn't doing anything particularly alarming, just standing still, sometimes near a tree, other times in the distance on a street corner. But there was something off about his presence. His posture was rigid, his eyes always turned slightly away from the camera, as if he was intentionally avoiding being noticed. But how could he have been in so many different places without me ever seeing him? I started to pay closer attention to every photo I took after that, looking for any hint of the man. I even began checking my older pictures, going back months to see if he had been there all along. And sure enough, he was. In a picture from a friend's wedding, he was standing on the edge of the group photo, barely visible in the background. In a photo I had taken while on a hike, there he was again, standing at the far end of the trail, his face just barely peeking from behind a large rock. The more I looked, the more he appeared each time, just far enough to be dismissed as nothing, but always there, always present. I couldn't explain it. I started to feel like I was being watched, like he was somehow following me, appearing in places I had never seen him before. It was as if he was leaving his mark on my life, subtly inserting himself into moments I thought were mine alone. His presence was like an invasive thought, always lingering, always just behind me. It was hard to shake the feeling that I wasn't in control of my own memories anymore, that someone else had a hand in shaping them. Desperation grew as I tried to make sense of it all. I showed the photos to friends and family, hoping someone would have an explanation, but no one recognized him. They all dismissed it as a weird coincidence or a trick of the light, but I could feel it, the unease gnawing at me. I started to worry that maybe I was losing my mind. Could my brain have been adding him to the photos somehow? A figment of my imagination manifesting itself in the background? Or was there something more to it? Was I being followed by someone, a stalker, or was it just something more sinister? I began to avoid taking pictures altogether, but that didn't help. It felt like the man was still there, his presence hanging in the air whenever I went out. I found myself checking over my shoulder more often, feeling like I was being followed even when I was alone. Each time I returned home, I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been there, just out of sight, watching me. It became harder and harder to tell if I was imagining it or if something truly strange was happening. A few weeks later, I decided to try something. I took a trip to a local park, my camera in hand, determined to take a picture without him appearing. I was determined to prove to myself that I could take a photo without him in it. I took several pictures, hoping for a clean shot, but when I reviewed them, there he was again, just barely visible in the background, standing near a bench, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. It was as if he was always there, no matter what I did. His presence was inescapable, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. The thought that he could be real, actually real, and not just some figment of my mind, began to take hold. I searched for any clue that might explain who he was, how he was able to be in so many places at once. I began to research stalking, paranoia, and the idea of photographic anomalies, but none of it seemed to fit. No one could explain how he had appeared in so many different photos, in places I hadn't even been aware of him being. I couldn't find any pattern in his locations either, other than the fact that he was always there, just out of reach. As the weeks went by, the anxiety continued to build. I couldn't stop checking my photos, couldn't stop searching for him in every shot I took. I started to wonder if he was aware of me, if he was deliberately inserting himself into my life. The idea that he had been watching me all along, hiding in the background of my memories, was terrifying. What did he want? Why had he been following me, in a sense, for so long? I started to question everything. The places I thought I had been alone, the moments that I had treasured as mine, now felt invaded. It was like someone had taken control of my memories and twisted them, putting this stranger into every part of my life. I even thought about deleting all the photos, getting rid of every trace of him, but I couldn't. It felt like he would always be there, even if I erased every photo I had taken. And then, one night, after months of relentless worry and fear, I took one last picture. I was in my living room, sitting on the couch, feeling a sense of finality settling over me. I aimed the camera at myself, determined to end this strange cycle. As I pressed the shutter button, I turned the camera around to see the result. There he was, standing behind me in the doorway, his face now visible for the first time. He was smiling. Story 2. I came home late one evening after a long day at work, tired and ready to relax. As I approached my front door, I noticed something strange. The porch light, which I always made sure to leave on when I left the house, was off. At first, I thought it was just a bulb that had burned out, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. The light bulb wasn't in the socket, it was unscrewed and carefully placed on the welcome mat, right in the center, as if someone had deliberately arranged it there. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. I checked the door, but it was locked as usual, and everything else around my home seemed normal. No signs of forced entry, no strange sounds, nothing that would indicate someone had been inside. But that bulb sitting there on the mat made everything feel off. It wasn't just that the bulb was unscrewed, it was the fact that it had been placed so neatly, as if someone had taken their time and made a conscious decision to leave it there. It felt personal, deliberate, and more unsettling than any of the usual strange occurrences I'd brushed off in the past. I bent down to pick up the bulb, feeling an odd sense of dread creeping up my spine. As I did, I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind a bush or appear from the shadows. The street was eerily quiet, and no one was in sight. The silence of the night seemed oppressive, as though the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. I walked back inside, locking the door behind me with a little more force than usual. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was definitely wrong. I sat down on the couch, the bulb still in my hand, trying to calm myself down. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I accidentally unscrewed it before I left? No, I was sure I hadn't. Had someone come to my house, entered without me knowing, and then left the light bulb on the mat for some reason? It didn't make sense. There was no reason for someone to leave a bulb like that, unless they were trying to send me some sort of message. But what was that message? And why leave it on the welcome mat, of all places? The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. I couldn't let it go. The light bulb was still in my hand, and the longer I held it, the heavier it felt. The light itself, when it worked, had always been something I took for granted. It was simple, reliable. But now, in the quiet of the night, It felt like a symbol of something much darker. The bulb seemed to hold a weight I couldn't explain, as though it carried some hidden meaning that I wasn't ready to understand. I put it down on the kitchen counter, trying to forget about it, but I couldn't. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every small sound seemed amplified in the silence. I kept hearing creaks in the walls, footsteps on the stairs, but whenever I'd get up to check, there was nothing. It was like the house was playing tricks on me, or worse, I was being watched. The bulb, the way it had been left on the mat, was all I could think about. I kept picturing someone standing there, unscrewing it slowly, deliberately, then placing it down as if to say, "I'm here." The next morning, I decided I couldn't leave things as they were. I had to find out what was going on. I started by checking the porch again, hoping for some clue I'd missed the night before. But there was nothing new. The mat was still where I had left it, the light fixture still empty. It all seemed like it had been some sort of bizarre prank, but something in my gut told me it wasn't that simple. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and checked the light bulb. It was still intact, no cracks or damage. It seemed normal, but why had it been removed and placed so neatly? Why had someone gone through the trouble of unscrewing it and leaving it out in plain view? It made no sense, and I was starting to feel like I was going crazy. I decided to take the bulb with me when I went out, just to make sure it wasn't some elaborate prank someone had planned for me. Throughout the day, I tried to go about my routine as usual. I went to work, met with some friends, and tried to distract myself from the strange events. But no matter what I did, my mind kept returning to that bulb, to the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone knew things about me they shouldn't. The unease continued to build, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I started questioning everything: my neighbors, my co-workers, even the people I thought I could trust. By the time I returned home, the sun had set, and the night was closing in around me. I hesitated at the door for a moment before unlocking it, as if bracing for what I might find inside. The porch light was off again, just as it had been the night before. But this time there was no bulb on the mat. I checked the ground around the door, but it was gone. The mat was empty. I couldn't explain it. Had someone taken it while I was gone? Or had I imagined the whole thing? I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. My mind was in a fog, and I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The weight of the situation was starting to overwhelm me. Was someone sneaking in and out of my house when I wasn't looking? Had they been watching me? I couldn't stand the thought of it anymore. I needed to get out. The next few days passed in a blur. I stayed at a friend's house for a while, not wanting to return home. When I did go back, I made sure to check everything: every lock, every window, every light switch. But nothing strange happened again. No more light bulbs on the mat, no more signs that someone had been inside. It was as if the whole thing had never happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been followed, that I had missed something important. I never figured out what happened that night or who had left the bulb on my porch. But I learned to lock my doors a little tighter, to check the windows a little more carefully, and to always trust my instincts when something felt wrong. The memory of that light bulb stayed with me, a strange, lingering presence that I couldn't escape. Story 3. I was going about my usual routine, trying to keep everything in order. It had been one of those mundane, uneventful days where nothing out of the ordinary seemed to happen. I was sitting at my desk working when I glanced over at my wall calendar. The colorful squares on the calendar hung in a neat line, each day marked with little notes and reminders that I had carefully planned out. But one thing caught my eye: a bright red X was drawn across a random date, right in the middle of the month. I froze, staring at the mark. I hadn't done that. I walked over to the calendar, my heart beginning to race. I studied the red X, trying to figure out what it could mean. It wasn't something I would do, not in the middle of all the other appointments and reminders that were written in my usual neat handwriting. It looked deliberate, but there was no reason for me to have marked that day. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner, but I was alone. My mind immediately began to race, trying to come up with any possible explanation. Had I been sleepwalking? I considered it for a moment, but I was certain that wasn't the case. I had been up late the night before, but nothing unusual had happened. I had gone to bed, woken up, and gone about my day. There was no reason why I would have marked a date on the calendar without remembering it. It was completely out of character for me. The more I stared at the X, the more unnerving it became. My eyes kept darting to the date, which was 2 weeks away. It felt like there was some significance to it, something I couldn't grasp. I pulled out my phone and checked my calendar app, hoping that perhaps I had set some kind of reminder or event for that day. But there was nothing. The digital version was clean, empty, as it should be. The X on the paper calendar seemed out of place, a stark contrast to everything else. I felt a creeping sense of unease, like the mark had appeared for a reason, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I had marked it without remembering. But as the hours passed, the feeling of dread only grew stronger. I couldn't stop thinking about the date and the red mark. It was as if it had a purpose, something I had to uncover, but I couldn't find any clue that would explain it. I went through all my notes, checked my emails, and even searched through old messages, but nothing seemed to explain the red X. It was as if it had appeared out of thin air, with no logical reason behind it. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the calendar, and the X stood out like a flashing warning sign. I tossed and turned in bed, my mind swirling with all sorts of dark thoughts. Maybe it was some kind of omen. Maybe the date marked something bad that was going to happen. The more I thought about it, the more irrational my fear became. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was nothing more than a simple mistake, but my gut told me otherwise. Something wasn't right. The next morning, I decided to take action. I went to the store and bought a new calendar, convinced that the one on the wall was somehow cursed. Maybe I had missed something hidden in plain sight. But when I returned home and hung the new calendar up, I found myself staring at the old one again, that red X mocking me. It felt like the new calendar couldn't fix the unease that had taken root inside me. The old calendar felt wrong, like a constant reminder of something I couldn't explain. A few days passed, and I did my best to ignore the mark, but it was impossible. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was some kind of warning. I had tried to go back through my daily routine, but the closer the marked date approached, the more uneasy I became. I would check the calendar every few hours, each time growing more anxious as the red X stared back at me. It was as if the mark was watching me, waiting for me to figure out what it meant. Then, a week before the marked date, something strange happened. I came home from work to find the door slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat, and I rushed inside, expecting the worst. But everything was exactly as I had left it except for one thing. The calendar was gone. I frantically searched the room, but there was no sign of it anywhere. It had vanished. My breath caught in my throat. Had someone come into my house? But why would they take the calendar? It didn't make sense. In a panic, I checked the new calendar I had just bought. It was still hanging on the wall, untouched. But the old calendar, the one with the red X, was gone. I searched my apartment, thinking maybe I had misplaced it, but there was no sign of it. I couldn't explain how it had disappeared, and the thought that someone had taken it only added to my unease. I began to wonder if the red X was meant to lead me to this point, to this moment of confusion and fear. What was going to happen when the date arrived? As the marked day drew closer, I couldn't focus on anything else. I couldn't eat, couldn't work. I kept thinking about the missing calendar and the strange events that had been happening around me. I began to feel like I was being watched, that someone or something was waiting for me to react. I avoided leaving the house, afraid that whatever was tied to the marked date would happen the moment I stepped outside. The night before the marked day, I had a strange dream. In the dream, I saw myself standing in front of the calendar, staring at the red X. But in this dream, the X wasn't just a mark, it was a symbol, glowing faintly in the darkness. A voice whispered to me, "It's time." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I had never felt so terrified in my life. Whatever was coming, I couldn't avoid it anymore. I spent the entire next day at home, watching the clock tick closer and closer to midnight. The day seemed to drag on forever, and by the time the evening came, I was nearly out of my mind. I waited for something, anything to happen, but nothing did. The date passed without incident. I sat in my living room, staring at the wall where the calendar used to be, my mind still racing with questions. What had all of this meant? Why had the calendar disappeared? And why had that date been marked? As the night wore on, I slowly began to relax, thinking that maybe it had all been some bizarre, unexplained coincidence. Maybe it had been nothing more than my overactive imagination, combined with the stress of my routine. But deep down, I knew there was something I was still missing, something I hadn't figured out yet. And that thought stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind as the days passed, always reminding me that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. Story 4. R. I found a lock of hair tied with a ribbon in my mailbox. The small bundle was neatly wrapped, a soft brown strand peeking out from under the delicate tie. At first, I thought it might have been a mistake or some strange prank. But as I held the lock of hair in my hand, a cold chill ran through me. There was no note, no explanation, just this single strange item. The fact that it had been placed there so carefully made it feel even more unsettling. I checked around the area, my eyes scanning the street for anything unusual, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. My neighbors were going about their usual routines and the street was quiet. No one seemed to notice anything strange. The mailman had just delivered the usual letters and packages, and this lock of hair wasn't there when I checked earlier in the morning. How had it ended up in my mailbox? I hesitated for a moment, my thoughts racing. Could it be a joke? A trick someone was playing on me? I didn't know anyone who would go to such lengths, especially not over something as bizarre as a lock of hair. The ribbon was simple, but it didn't seem to be from any kind of gift I had received recently. I didn't recognize it, and it certainly wasn't mine. I didn't know anyone who had hair like that either. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I wondered who would do something so strange and why. I considered calling the police, but then stopped myself. What would I even say? Someone put a lock of hair in my mailbox. It didn't seem like a legitimate crime, at least not one I could prove. I had no idea where it had come from, or who it belonged to. All I had was the eerie feeling that something wasn't right. I tucked the lock of hair back into the envelope and brought it inside, carefully placing it on my kitchen counter, away from the rest of my things. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I passed the kitchen, I glanced at the small envelope, the lock of hair resting inside. It seemed almost like a warning, something that was meant to get my attention. But it made no sense. Who would want to send me such an unsettling gift? And what did it mean? I tried to go about my evening as normally as I could, but I kept feeling like I was on edge, as if the air around me was thicker, more oppressive. I decided to go to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would clear my mind. But sleep wouldn't come. I tossed and turned, the image of the lock of hair constantly appearing in my mind. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that something wasn't just strange about it, it was terrifying. The idea that someone had been close enough to my house to put something like that in my mailbox without me noticing was too much. I hadn't heard anyone outside, and I hadn't seen any unfamiliar cars nearby. In the morning, I awoke to an uneasy sense of dread. I had barely slept, my mind constantly replaying the events of the previous day. I went straight to the kitchen, checking the envelope once again. I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was only when I opened the envelope fully, preparing to dispose of it, that I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a faint, almost imperceptible stain on the lock of hair, something dark, something that didn't belong there. It looked like blood. My stomach dropped as I stared at the small mark, unable to look away. Had the hair been from someone else, someone who was hurt? Or had it been placed there intentionally as a message, a warning? The possibilities were endless, but none of them made me feel any better. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a nightmare I couldn't escape. I couldn't just ignore it any longer. I called the police and explained everything: the strange lock of hair, the ribbon, the feeling of being watched. The officer on the other end of the line sounded skeptical, but agreed to send someone out to investigate. A few hours later, 2 officers arrived at my house. They took the lock of hair and the ribbon and collected a sample of the stain for analysis. Despite their professionalism, I could see that they were just as uneasy as I was. They asked me if I had any enemies, or if I had recently received any threatening letters or messages. I thought about it for a moment. I had no real enemies that I knew of, and I hadn't received anything out of the ordinary. No strange letters, no phone calls, nothing to suggest that I was being targeted. The only thing I could think of was the strange incident with the hair. The officers promised to look into it, but something told me that they didn't know what to make of it either. That evening, as I sat in my living room, I felt the weight of the situation settling in. I couldn't stop thinking about the lock of hair. It felt like a puzzle with pieces missing, like something far bigger than just a simple oddity. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was one of the officers telling me that the test results had come back on the stain. It was indeed blood. My heart raced. The officer didn't have much more information. They said that the blood type didn't match mine, but they couldn't identify whose blood it was. The case was now being treated as a potential threat, but with no leads, the investigation was at a standstill. I felt a deep sense of unease creeping into my bones. Days turned into weeks, but nothing changed. No new developments, no signs of anyone being in my yard or home. The police had no new leads, and I was left to wonder whether the person who had left the lock of hair in my mailbox was still out there, watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still close, still waiting for the right moment. It felt like the calm before a storm, like something was going to happen, but I couldn't predict when or how. Then, one day, weeks after the incident, I found something new in my mailbox. It was another lock of hair, tied with a ribbon, but this time the hair was different. It was blonde. The sickening feeling in my stomach returned. There was no note, no explanation, just another lock of hair, carefully placed in my mailbox as if to say, I'm still here. The ribbon was the same as before, and the stain on the hair was darker this time. The fear in my chest was overwhelming. I don't know who is doing this or why, but I know now that this is only the beginning. Whoever is leaving these locks of hair isn't done with me yet. I have no answers, no way of stopping it. All I know is that someone is watching, and I don't think I'll ever feel safe in my home again. Story 5. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening when I arrived at my car after a long day of work. The sun had already set, and the parking lot was relatively quiet. I was tired, ready to go home and unwind, but something caught my eye as I approached my vehicle. A single playing card lay on the windshield, its edges slightly fluttering in the breeze. The card was face up, showing the Queen of Hearts, its bold red and black design stark against the darkness around it. I stopped for a moment, puzzled, and then noticed something else. There was a handwritten message on the card, scrawled in uneven, almost frantic handwriting, "See you soon." My first thought was that it had to be some sort of prank. Maybe a friend or even a neighbor had decided to mess with me. But as I stood there, holding the card in my hands, a chill ran down my spine. The handwriting was not familiar, and I didn't know anyone who would leave something like this for me. My mind raced with questions. Who left this here? What did it mean? Why the Queen of Hearts? Why now? I checked the surrounding area, but the parking lot was empty. There were no cars nearby, no figures lurking in the shadows. It was just me and the card. I almost laughed at myself for getting so worked up over something so seemingly trivial, but the unease didn't go away. I slipped the card into my pocket, climbed into my car, and drove home, the feeling of being watched lingering in the back of my mind. The next few days were uneventful, or so I thought. Life resumed its usual pace, and I did my best to forget about the card. But the message wouldn't leave me. Every time I thought about it, the words "see you soon" echoed in my mind, making me anxious. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a warning or some kind of omen. Who would do something like this? And what did they want from me? A week later, I returned to my car after work, hoping to put the strange incident behind me. But when I approached my vehicle, my heart sank. Another card. This time it was the Ace of Spades, the dark image standing out against the bright paper. There was another message on the card, written in the same handwriting: "You're not alone." I stood frozen for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. The cards, the messages, it couldn't be a coincidence. Someone was trying to tell me something, or worse, they were trying to get my attention. I looked around again, but no one was in sight. I couldn't help but feel paranoid, as though someone was watching me from a distance. I examined the area more thoroughly this time, checking for any signs of movement or hidden figures, but the lot remained still and empty. No one was there. The card was the only thing that seemed to exist in that moment. As I drove home, my thoughts raced. What did the messages mean? Who was leaving them? Were they harmless, or was I in some sort of danger? The second message had made it clear that whoever was doing this knew something about me, something that made me feel vulnerable and exposed. I hadn't told anyone about the first card, but somehow they seemed to know about it. It was as if they had been waiting for the right time to strike again. I kept the card in my glove compartment, unsure of what to do with it. I didn't tell anyone, afraid they would dismiss my worries or think I was overreacting. But the unease was growing, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I began to take a different route home from work, hoping to avoid the parking lot and any other potential surprises. But it didn't matter. The fear was already planted in my mind, and it didn't go away. Days turned into weeks, and every time I checked my car, I half expected to find another card. But nothing came. The silence was almost worse than the cards themselves. I started to convince myself that it was just a strange coincidence, that maybe I had overblown the whole situation. But deep down, I knew that the messages were not over. Then, one evening, nearly a month after the last card, I arrived at my car, expecting the usual empty parking lot. But this time something was different. The air felt thick, heavy, as if something was about to happen. As I walked toward my car, my eyes locked onto the windshield. There, lying flat against the glass, was a third card. This time it was the Jack of Diamonds. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I turned it over. The message read, "It's time." My heart raced and my pulse quickened. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, my mouth dry. The message was direct, unmistakable. This was no longer a game. Whoever had been leaving the cards was ready for something. But what? And why me? What was their plan? I took the card and rushed into my car, locking the doors behind me. I couldn't think straight. I drove aimlessly for a while, trying to clear my head. But the questions kept swirling, each one more pressing than the last. Who was doing this? What did they want from me? And why was it happening now? I had to do something about it, but I didn't know where to start. That night, I decided to take action. I called the police, explaining the situation and the strange events that had been unfolding over the past few weeks. They listened, though I could tell they were skeptical. They promised to investigate, but I wasn't sure how seriously they would take my concerns. After all, it seemed so bizarre, playing cards, cryptic messages. It didn't seem like something anyone would take seriously. But I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. The next few days were filled with tension, each one dragging on with the knowledge that something was coming. I continued to check my car every day, hoping for some sign that this would all end, that the cards would stop appearing. But there was nothing. The silence was deafening, and it only made me more anxious. Then, one evening, I walked into the parking lot after work, dreading what I might find. My eyes darted across the area, searching for any sign of the familiar cards, but there was nothing. No card, no message, nothing. It felt almost anticlimactic, as if the story had come to an end. I exhaled, relieved yet still on edge. I couldn't explain it, but something told me that the threat wasn't over. Whoever had been leaving the cards was waiting for the right moment, just as they had before. Days turned into weeks again, and the feeling of unease began to fade. But the memory of the cards, the strange messages, lingered. I never did figure out who was behind them or why they chose me. The police never found anything unusual, and life continued. But deep down, I always kept a wary eye on my surroundings, wondering if someday the cards would return. And if they ever did, I would be ready. Story 6. It started as a simple, yet odd occurrence. I had been sitting at my desk working on a project for hours. My laptop was open in front of me, the screen displaying lines of text and a few open tabs. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a faint light flicker from the camera area of my laptop. It wasn't the usual green light that illuminated when I used the camera. It was a brief, irregular blink, almost as if the camera was turning on and off by itself. I stared at it for a moment, unsure of what to think. Maybe it was a glitch, a malfunction with my laptop's hardware. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was nothing to worry about, and returned to my work. The next day, I noticed the same blinking light again. This time it caught my attention more quickly. I had only just opened my laptop when I saw the camera light flash again, just for a second, before fading. I immediately closed the laptop and stared at it, heart racing slightly. Why was the camera turning on when I wasn't using it? My first thought was that it could be some sort of malware or spyware. I had heard of stories where hackers would access people's cameras without their knowledge, but I always thought those things happened to other people. Never to me. I immediately started running antivirus and anti-malware software on my laptop, hoping to find something that would explain the strange behavior. While the scan was running, I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was probably just a malfunction. Maybe the camera was faulty, or there was some setting I hadn't noticed. The scan came back clean, with no signs of anything unusual. My laptop was free of viruses and malware, but the blinking light still puzzled me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next few days, I kept a close eye on the laptop. Every time I used it, I made sure to look at the camera light, hoping it wouldn't blink again. But each time, without fail, the light would flicker briefly, almost as if it were testing me. I started to feel paranoid. Was someone watching me? I had no evidence to suggest that my camera was being accessed, but the idea that someone could be spying on me without my knowledge was terrifying. I started taking precautions. I covered the camera with a small piece of tape whenever I wasn't using it, just to be safe. But the blinking light continued, even when the camera was covered. It made no sense. One night, I decided to do a bit of research on the issue. I was sitting at my desk scrolling through forums and articles, trying to find anyone else who had experienced something similar. As I read through various threads, I found stories from other people who had noticed their laptop cameras turning on without explanation. Some of them mentioned strange noises or flickering lights on their screens when the camera activated, but none of them had any real answers. Most of them chalked it up to faulty hardware or software bugs, but I couldn't dismiss it that easily. Something about it felt off, like I was missing something important. A few weeks passed, and the blinking camera light became a regular part of my daily routine. Every time I sat down to work, I would glance over at the camera, waiting for the light to flash. It became an obsessive habit, something I couldn't ignore. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that it was just a glitch, but deep down, I couldn't shake the unease that crept up every time I saw that light blink. I began to check the camera settings constantly, making sure it wasn't accidentally turned on by some application running in the background, but everything appeared normal. Then, one evening, I was on a video call with a friend. The conversation was going smoothly, and we were catching up on life. But halfway through, I noticed something strange. The camera light blinked again, but this time it stayed on for a few seconds longer than usual. I froze, staring at the light in disbelief. I quickly glanced at my friend on the call, trying to gauge if they noticed anything unusual. But they were focused on the conversation, completely unaware of the camera's behavior. My mind started racing. I had no idea who could be accessing my camera, or why. As soon as the call ended, I shut my laptop and sat there in silence for a long time. I had no idea what to do next. I felt trapped, unable to ignore the growing suspicion that someone was watching me. I remembered reading about hackers who could take control of webcams, accessing them without any indication to the user. I thought back to the stories I had heard about people being spied on through their own devices. Could I be one of those victims? The next morning, I decided to take more drastic measures. I unplugged my laptop, powered it down completely, and started to search for more answers. I considered buying a new laptop, something more secure, but the idea of losing all of my work and files felt overwhelming. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the constant feeling of being watched was starting to wear on me. Then, out of nowhere, I got an unexpected message. It was from an unknown number, and the message was short, direct, and chilling. "We see you." My heart skipped a beat, and my hands trembled as I read it. Could this be the person who had been accessing my camera? How could they know about my laptop and my suspicion? I immediately deleted the message and blocked the number, but the feeling of dread only intensified. It was as if they were toying with me, slowly tightening their grip. I felt like I was losing my mind. I couldn't focus on anything, couldn't sleep, couldn't even work. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone watching me through my screen. Their eyes fixed on me from behind the camera lens. I knew I had to take action, but I didn't know where to start. It wasn't just about the camera anymore. It was about my privacy, my safety, and my peace of mind. That afternoon, I decided to take the laptop to a professional. I needed someone who could look at it from a technical standpoint, someone who could find out if anything was truly wrong. The technician checked my laptop for any security vulnerabilities, any traces of malware or spyware. After a thorough examination, they came back with surprising news. There was nothing wrong with the laptop itself. No viruses, no hacks, no security breaches. The technician suggested that it might be a software glitch, something in the operating system that caused the camera light to flicker randomly. Relieved but still uneasy, I decided to take their advice and reset my laptop to factory settings. I wiped everything clean, reinstalling only the necessary programs. I even made sure to install additional security software, hoping to prevent any future issues. After the reset, the camera light no longer blinked. It seemed like the problem had been fixed. But as I sat back down to work, a thought crossed my mind. What if the glitch wasn't the real issue? What if it was something else entirely? I had done everything I could to protect myself, but there was still a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere was still watching. Story 7. I received a text that read, "Turn around," but no one was there. My phone buzzed as I sat in my living room, scrolling through a few messages from friends and family. At first, I thought it was just a random message from a number I didn't recognize. The message itself was simple, almost too simple, and it sent a strange chill down my spine. The words on the screen seemed harmless enough, but something about them made my stomach tighten. I looked around my apartment, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway or lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. The living room was as quiet and still as it always was. I hesitated, staring at the message again, trying to make sense of it. Why would someone send such a cryptic text? And more importantly, who had sent it? I checked the number again, but it wasn't one I recognized. It was just a string of digits, no name attached. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a wave of unease washed over me. My mind raced with all sorts of thoughts. Was this some sort of prank? Or was it something more sinister? My first instinct was to ignore it, to carry on as though nothing had happened. But the words "turn around" echoed in my head. Something told me I had to listen. I wasn't sure why, but it felt like I had no choice. I slowly turned in my seat, scanning the room behind me. The living room was still empty. There were no figures hiding in the corners, no sudden movement in the dim light. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe I was just overthinking it. After all, it was a common trick, wasn't it? Someone sending a vague message to stir up fear. It was probably nothing. But then I noticed something. The kitchen light, which had been turned off earlier, was now on. The faint glow illuminated the hallway just past the living room, casting long shadows along the floor. I froze, staring at the light as it flickered, almost as though someone had just turned it on. My heart began to race, and I immediately stood up, walking cautiously toward the kitchen. The closer I got, the more I felt the weight of the silence around me. The hairs on my arms stood up as if I were being watched. I stepped into the kitchen, checking every corner, every shadow, but there was no one. The room was empty, just like it should have been. I quickly moved to the light switch, flipping it off again, but a deep, unsettling feeling still lingered. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing right behind me, but nothing. The room felt cold now, like a strange chill had settled in. I returned to the living room, heart still pounding, and glanced back down at my phone. The message was still there, sitting innocently in my inbox. Turn around. I had done it, hadn't I? I had turned around, and nothing had happened. but the strange sense of dread wouldn't leave me. It clung to me, heavy and suffocating. I looked around the apartment again, half expecting to see someone lurking in the dark, watching me. After a few moments, I sat back down on the couch, trying to calm myself. It was just a prank, I told myself. A silly, childish prank. But the fear in my chest didn't dissipate. It only grew stronger. I kept imagining someone outside my apartment, standing just beyond the window, watching me through the glass. Maybe they were waiting for me to make the next move, to step outside so they could confront me. My mind began to spin with possibilities, each one darker than the last. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through social media, hoping it would take my mind off the unsettling feeling that had settled over me. But every time my eyes strayed back to the phone, I couldn't help but think about that message. Who had sent it? What did it mean? And why did it feel like something was about to happen? I spent the next few hours in a haze, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. I checked the locks on my doors and windows again, just to make sure everything was secure. But it didn't help. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that nothing felt normal. The house felt empty, silent, as if something was waiting for me to make the next move. Finally, as the night wore on, I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. I had to be. There was no one out there. No one was watching me. It was all in my head. I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, trying to shake off the anxiety that had built up over the past few hours. I pulled the covers tight around me and shut my eyes, willing myself to sleep. But as I lay there in the darkness, my phone buzzed again. Look outside. I felt the blood drain from my face. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to look outside. But the message was clear. Whoever was sending these texts was playing with me, drawing me into a twisted game I didn't want to be a part of. I sat up in bed, my hands shaking as I held the phone. I stared at the message for a moment, trying to decide whether or not to look. The fear that had been growing all evening seemed to peak now. I didn't want to face whatever was waiting for me out there. But the thought of ignoring the message, of leaving it unanswered, felt even worse. I had to know. Slowly I got up and walked to the window. I pulled back the curtain, heart pounding in my chest, praying I wouldn't see anything. Nothing. The street outside was empty. The only thing that moved was the faint breeze, rustling the leaves of a tree across the road. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a mixture of relief and confusion. There was no one there. No one was watching. It had all been a false alarm, nothing more than a strange series of events that my mind had twisted into something more sinister than it really was. As I turned away from the window, my phone buzzed once more. This time the message was different. Turn around. And I froze, my blood running cold. This time when I turned, I wasn't alone. Story 8. It was a late evening, and I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone, trying to wind down after a long day. The house was quiet, just the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house settled. My bedroom window was slightly cracked open, just enough to let in a cool breeze, and the curtains fluttered gently. The streetlights outside cast faint shadows on the walls, and I felt a strange sense of peace. That was until I heard it. At first, it was barely audible, just a soft, almost melodic sound, like someone humming a tune in the distance. I froze, staring at the window, listening carefully. It didn't sound like a song I recognized. It was faint, almost like a whisper in the wind, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was humming outside my window. My heart began to race. I couldn't explain it, but something about the sound sent a chill down my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was a neighbor or the wind playing tricks on me. But the humming didn't stop. It grew louder, clearer, as if someone was standing right outside, just on the other side of the glass. My pulse quickened, and I pulled the blankets up to my chin, feeling more and more uneasy. The humming was slow and haunting, almost as if the person didn't care if anyone heard them. It wasn't frantic or scared. It was calm, deliberate, and that made it worse. I lay there for a while, listening to the soft, eerie melody, unsure of what to do. Should I check outside? Should I call someone? I wasn't sure. I didn't want to make a sound and alert whoever was out there that I knew they were there. But the humming wouldn't stop. It went on, looping in the same eerie pattern. My mind raced, trying to come up with logical explanations, but none seemed to fit. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I slowly got out of bed, heart pounding in my chest, and crept toward the window. I was too afraid to open the blinds fully, so I just peeked through the small gap between them, straining my eyes in the dim light. I saw nothing at first, just the empty yard, the trees swaying in the wind, the faint outline of the fence. No one was there. But the humming continued, growing louder still, as if taunting me, as if the person knew I was listening. I pulled back from the window, feeling a wave of panic. My mind was racing. How could this be happening? Who would be standing outside, humming at this hour? And why couldn't I see them? I tried to rationalize it, but I couldn't. It didn't make sense. I felt trapped, as if the walls of the house were closing in on me. The humming was relentless, steady, and strange. I didn't want to get any closer to the window, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I had to see who was out there. Slowly, I lifted the blinds just a little more, my breath shallow, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was behind the sound. And then, I saw it. There, in the shadows near the edge of the yard, a figure was standing. It was hard to make out any details in the dim light, but the person appeared to be hunched over slightly, as if lost in the rhythm of their humming. They weren't facing the house, and their back was to me. The humming was louder now, almost deafening, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Who was this person? Why were they standing outside my window in the dark, humming a strange tune? My heart thudded in my chest, and I quickly ducked away from the window, praying that they hadn't noticed me. I could still hear the humming, but it was now echoing in my ears, making it hard to think clearly. I wanted to run out of the room, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen with fear. Minutes felt like hours, and the humming seemed to go on forever. Eventually the sound faded. It was subtle at first, almost like the wind had picked up and carried the melody away. But the silence that followed was even more unsettling. I waited for what felt like an eternity, hoping the person would leave, hoping that I could escape the feeling of dread that was clawing at my chest. When I finally gathered enough courage to peek through the blinds again, the yard was empty. The figure was gone. There was no sign of anyone. I tried to tell myself that it was just a prank, or maybe someone wandering the neighborhood, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. The humming had been real. Someone had been outside my window, and for some reason they had decided to hum at me in the middle of the night. It wasn't a random occurrence. It felt deliberate, like they had been waiting for me to hear them. The thought made my skin crawl, and I immediately locked the window, drawing the blinds tightly shut. I sat in my bed trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing in the shadows. The next day, I checked the yard. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. The grass was undisturbed, and the ground was dry. It was as if the night had never happened. But the memory of the humming, the eerie tune that seemed to fill my entire world, stayed with me. It wasn't something I could easily forget. I still don't know who was outside my window that night, or why they chose to hum. But I haven't heard the sound again. Still, every night, I double-check the locks on my windows before I go to sleep, and I keep the curtains tightly shut. I don't know if I'll ever find out who it was or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never forget the feeling of being watched while that haunting, steady hum echoed through the silence. Story 9. A car followed me for miles before abruptly turning off without explanation. I first noticed it a few minutes after I left the grocery store. It was a black sedan, just a few cars behind me. At first I thought it was coincidence, maybe someone was heading in the same direction. But as I continued driving, I realized the car was still behind me, never falling too far back. My heart began to race. It felt like the driver was deliberately keeping pace with me, like they were waiting for something. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was nothing. But then the car made the same turns I did, followed the same streets. It wasn't just behind me, it was close, too close. I could see its headlights in my rearview mirror, always in my blind spot, almost as if it were testing my every move. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, watched. I tried to lose it, changing lanes and making a few sharp turns, but the sedan stayed right behind me, unrelenting. I started to panic. What if this was something more than coincidence? What if someone was following me for a reason? I didn't know who it could be, or why they would be following me, but the unease in my chest grew with every mile. I checked my mirrors again, but the sedan was still there, a dark shape looming behind me. I made a turn onto a quieter street, hoping to throw the car off, but it stayed right with me. I decided to keep driving, my thoughts racing faster than the car on the road. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the sedan turned off. No warning, no sign. One moment it was there, tailing me, and the next, it was gone, turning down a side street I hadn't even noticed before. I glanced in my mirrors again, but it was completely out of sight. For a moment I just drove, unsure of what to make of it. My heart was still pounding, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What had that been? Why had they followed me? What was the purpose? I continued my drive, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting the black sedan to reappear, but it didn't. Each minute that passed made me feel more exposed, more vulnerable. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something wasn't right. Was it a random driver just out for a drive? Was I overthinking it? I tried to rationalize the situation, but my gut told me otherwise. It wasn't just a coincidence. Someone had been following me, and it wasn't just random. When I finally got home, I parked in my driveway, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through me. I checked around the street, scanning for any sign of the black sedan, but there was nothing. No trace of the car, no sign of anyone else on the road. I locked the door behind me and sat in my living room, trying to calm down. But every creak in the house, every shift in the air, felt like someone was still watching, waiting. I spent the rest of the evening looking out the window, waiting for the sedan to appear again. I didn't know if I was being paranoid or if I was genuinely in danger. But whatever it was, the unease lingered. The thought of being followed, of someone knowing where I was at all times, felt suffocating. What if it was just the beginning? What if there was more to this than I realized? I couldn't stop thinking about the car, the way it had followed me for so long without explanation, only to disappear without a trace. I didn't have answers, but the feeling of being hunted wouldn't leave me. Story 10. I came home to find all my windows open, even though it was winter. The cold hit me as soon as I stepped through the door, a sharp, biting chill that made me shiver. I stood in the doorway for a moment, stunned, wondering if I had forgotten to close them before leaving. But I was sure I had shut everything properly, There was no way I would have left the windows open in such freezing temperatures. It didn't make sense. I went to each window one by one, closing them as I went. The wind howled outside, pushing against the glass with an eerie force. The cold air felt unnatural, as if something had been deliberately trying to get in. As I closed the last window, I glanced around the room, noticing that everything seemed off. My living room, which I had left in perfect order, now looked as if someone had been through it. The couch cushions were out of place, and there were small scuff marks on the floor, like someone had dragged furniture around. But I lived alone, and I was certain no one had been there. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had caused the windows to open. Maybe I was being forgetful. But as I moved through the house, closing windows in the other rooms, I felt an increasing sense of unease. There was something about the way everything was out of place that didn't sit right with me. My heart began to race as I moved through the house, checking each room more carefully, but finding nothing that explained why it felt so wrong. I finally made my way to the kitchen, where I found the back door slightly ajar. My mind was racing now, trying to make sense of it all. How could this happen? I always locked the doors. I always double-checked. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how impossible it was for this to be some accident. Someone had been in my house. But who? And why? Panic crept into my chest, tightening with every passing second. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I explained the situation as best I could, but as I waited for their arrival, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The house seemed too quiet, too still. It was as if something or someone was watching me. I moved cautiously through the rooms, checking behind furniture and in closets, but there was no one there. Still, the unease gnawed at me. Someone had been in my house. I was sure of it. When the police arrived, they took a thorough look around. They couldn't find any signs of forced entry, and they didn't seem to think anything was stolen. But the feeling of intrusion, of being violated, hung in the air. The officers left, telling me to lock up properly and be more cautious in the future, but the tension in my chest didn't subside. It only grew stronger. Something didn't add up. I couldn't shake the image of my windows, wide open, as if inviting whoever had been in my home to return. That night, I locked every door and window again, triple-checking everything. I even set up some extra security measures, alarms, cameras, anything I could think of. But as I lay in bed, the fear didn't let go. The house felt empty, but it also felt watched. I couldn't explain it. My mind raced with the possibilities. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had broken in and left no trace. But something told me that wasn't the case. Whoever or whatever was behind this, they knew exactly what they were doing. The next few days passed in a blur. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. I would wake up in the middle of the night, certain I had heard a sound, only to find everything perfectly still when I checked. But the fear lingered. The feeling of being watched never quite left. And then, just when I thought I might start to feel normal again, I came home one afternoon to find all the windows open once more. Every single one of them. My heart stopped. I rushed inside, checking the house, but nothing seemed out of place this time. No scuff marks, no signs of forced entry. The house was exactly as I had left it. But the windows were wide open, letting in the bitter cold of winter. I stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of what to do next. Who could be doing this? How could they get in without leaving a trace? I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep living in fear. I decided to install even more security measures, more cameras, more alarms, just to be sure. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't help. The feeling that someone was always just outside my reach, always watching, never went away. The next few nights I stayed awake, listening for any sound, any movement. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, always waiting for something to happen. Then, one morning I received a package at my door. It was small, unmarked, with no return address. I opened it, and inside was another cassette tape. It was labeled "You Shouldn't Have Looked." My stomach dropped. The words echoed in my mind, the same chilling warning that haunted me. My hands shook as I held the tape. I didn't want to play it. I knew what it meant. But I couldn't resist. I grabbed my tape player and pressed play. The static filled the room, just like the first time. And then, the voice came through. "You should have stayed away," it whispered. "Now you can't escape." The tape clicked off abruptly, and for the first time I felt the true weight of what I was dealing with. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, that I had to be imagining things. But deep down I knew. There was no prank, no simple explanation. Someone or something was inside my house, and it wasn't just coming to scare me. It was coming for something much worse. Story 11. I found a small box on my porch containing an old key with no explanation. The box was simple, unmarked, and looked like it had been sitting there for some time. The key inside was heavy, rusted at the edges, and had intricate carvings along the shaft that seemed out of place. I picked it up carefully, running my fingers over the cool metal, trying to figure out what it could possibly open. There was no note, no clue as to who had left it or why. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe it had been delivered to the wrong house, or someone had accidentally dropped it on my porch. But as I examined the key further, a sense of unease settled in my stomach. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't sit right. It didn't look like a typical key, and it wasn't for any of the doors in my house. I went inside and checked every drawer, every lock, but none of them matched the key. I kept it with me, wondering if I would eventually figure out where it belonged. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the key had some purpose, something more than just an old piece of metal. I started to search the house, examining every locked door and cupboard, even ones I hadn't thought about in years. Maybe it was for an attic or a basement I didn't remember locking, or perhaps a storage unit I had long since forgotten. But no matter where I looked, the key didn't fit. The thought of the key began to consume me. It was as if it was calling me, urging me to find the lock it belonged to. I couldn't explain it, but I felt drawn to it in a way that didn't make sense. I began to look around my neighborhood, searching for anything that might match the old key. I asked a few neighbors if they had ever seen a similar key or if they knew of any old houses with unusual locks. But no one had any answers. It felt like I was chasing a ghost, trying to find something that didn't exist. Then one evening, as I was out for a walk, I stumbled upon an old, run-down building at the edge of my street. I had lived in the neighborhood for years and never noticed it before. The windows were boarded up and the door was locked with a rusty padlock, the kind you would find on a forgotten shed or abandoned house. A strange impulse urged me to try the key, even though I couldn't explain why. I walked up to the door and inserted the key into the lock. To my surprise, the key turned effortlessly, the metal sliding smoothly into place. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest, as if the building hadn't been disturbed in ages. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under my weight. The room was empty, save for piles of old furniture covered in sheets. It felt as though time had stopped here, like nothing had moved in years. I stepped further inside, my heart pounding in my chest, wondering what I was about to find. As I wandered through the room, I noticed something strange, a large, ornate mirror hanging on one of the walls. The glass was cloudy, but it still reflected my image. As I approached it, I saw a faint shadow in the reflection that didn't match mine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow moved, as if it was trying to get my attention. I spun around, but there was no one behind me. I turned back to the mirror, and the shadow was gone. I quickly backed away from it, my mind racing. What was happening? I had only come to find the lock that the key opened, but now it felt like I had stepped into something far darker. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the floor near the door, a small piece of paper, crumpled and torn. I bent down to pick it up, my hands trembling. It was a note, written in jagged handwriting, "You shouldn't have come here." The word sent a chill down my spine. I quickly ran out of the building, locking the door behind me. I felt a sense of dread wash over me, as if I had been part of something I didn't fully understand. I still had the key in my pocket, but now it felt heavier, more ominous. What was it for? Why had I been drawn to that place? I tried to forget about the key, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow in the mirror. I couldn't stop thinking about the building, the note, and the feeling that I had been part of something I wasn't supposed to witness. Weeks went by, and I tried to move on, but the sense of unease never left. I couldn't shake the feeling that the key was meant for something more than I had realized. One night, as I was sitting in my living room, I heard a faint knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hesitated for a moment before going to answer it. When I opened the door, no one was there. But lying on the doorstep was another small box, identical to the one I had found months ago. Inside was another key, this one more ornate than the last, with symbols etched into its surface. There was no note, no explanation, just the key. I stood frozen, holding it in my hand, knowing that somehow this was far from over. The building, the mirror, the shadows, they were all connected, and the key was just the beginning. Story 12. I arrived at work one morning, as I did every day, expecting the usual routine. The office was quiet, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights filling the otherwise still air. I dropped my bag onto the chair and turned towards my desk, but as I did, something caught my eye. On the surface of the desk, etched into the wood, was my name perfectly carved, as if someone had spent a great deal of time making sure it was just right. The font was familiar, like something I had seen before, and the deep lines stood out sharply against the grain of the wood. But I had never seen it there before. It hadn't been there yesterday, and it didn't make any sense. I leaned closer, my heart beating a little faster, trying to make sense of the situation. The engraving was clean, almost too clean for something that would be done on a desk that had seen so much use. I ran my fingers over the markings, feeling the smooth, cool surface of the wood where the lines had been cut into it. The desk had never looked like this before. There had never been anything on it aside from the usual clutter: papers, pens, a few coffee stains. But now, in the middle of it all, was my name. The strange thing was that I had never seen anyone near my desk at the office, let alone someone using a sharp object to carve into the surface. I stepped back, looking around the office, half expecting to see someone lurking nearby, waiting for me to notice. But the space was empty, just as it had been when I first walked in. The other desks were empty, with papers scattered around, computers quietly idling, but no one in sight. It seemed like an ordinary morning, nothing unusual, except for the carved name on my desk. I sat down, still trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone was playing a joke on me. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Who would go to the trouble of etching my name into the wood, and why? I picked up my phone and called a few of my coworkers, but no one had any explanation for what I had found. They all sounded just as confused as I was, insisting that they hadn't seen anything strange around the office. It was strange, too, that no one had mentioned anything about it the day before, when I had left. The desk had been just as it always was, messy, with a few coffee cups left behind and papers scattered in random piles, but there had been no sign of anyone working on it, no carving of any kind. I sat there for a few more minutes, the unease creeping up my spine, making it hard to focus on anything else. I began to look at the other desks around the office more closely, half expecting to see similar markings on other surfaces, but none of the desks had anything like it. There were no carvings, no names, no strange signs. It made me wonder, was I the only one who had this happen to them? I checked my own name again, tracing the letters with my finger. The sharpness of the cuts made it clear that this wasn't something done by accident. It was deliberate. But why? And by who? The rest of the morning passed slowly, with the unease hanging over me like a cloud. I couldn't focus on my work, my mind constantly drifting back to the desk and that strange engraving. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept returning. Who would know my name well enough to etch it into my desk like that? I couldn't think of anyone who would have had a reason to do something like that. It wasn't a harmless prank, it felt far more intentional, like a message that I wasn't understanding. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. I thought back to the previous day, trying to recall if there had been anything strange about my routine. Had I seen anything out of place? Had anyone been watching me? I couldn't remember anything unusual, but the feeling of being watched lingered, and it was making me more paranoid by the minute. I considered talking to my boss, but I didn't want to sound crazy. What would I even say? Someone carved my name into my desk. It didn't seem like something that could be explained away easily. As the day went on, the desk became harder to ignore. I tried to work, tried to do my tasks as usual, but every time I glanced down, my eyes would be drawn back to the engraving. The more I looked at it, the more it felt like it was staring back at me. It wasn't just a random set of marks on a desk, it felt personal. Like whoever had done it was trying to communicate something to me, something I wasn't able to grasp. Finally, I decided to go home early. I needed to get away from the office, from the unease that seemed to follow me wherever I went. When I got home, I tried to relax, but the day's events were still playing over and over in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that I was missing something important. That night, I had trouble sleeping, constantly tossing and turning, wondering who had carved my name into my desk and why. Was it a message? Was someone trying to warn me? Or was I just overthinking everything? The next morning, I returned to work, dreading the moment I would have to face the desk again. As I stepped into the office, I glanced over at it, my heart sinking when I saw that nothing had changed. My name was still there, etched into the wood like it had been before. But this time it felt different. It felt more permanent, like it wasn't just a random act, it was something that had been planned, something that had meaning. I stood in front of the desk, staring at the engraving, when a voice behind me made me jump. It was my coworker, Mark, looking at the desk with a raised eyebrow. He said, "Is that new? Your name?" I don't remember it being there before. I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. I had no idea how to explain it, how to tell him that I hadn't done it, and had no idea who had. "It wasn't here yesterday," I said, trying to sound calm, but my voice came out shaky. Mark's eyes narrowed as he looked at it again. He stepped forward and traced his finger over the carving, as if to confirm that it was real. "That's odd," he muttered. "I wonder if someone did it during the night." But there was no explanation for it. No one had been in the office the night before. I was the first one there every morning, and I had never noticed anyone hanging around after hours. The feeling of dread that had settled over me only grew stronger as I realized that I had no answers. Weeks passed, and nothing else strange happened. The engraving remained, and I eventually learned to ignore it, though it always seemed to haunt the corner of my mind. I would think about it late at night, wondering who had done it and why. Had it been a warning? Had it been a message from someone who knew more about me than I realized? But I never found out. Story 13. I had just finished cleaning up from dinner and was settling in for a quiet evening when the knock at the door startled me. It was odd for anyone to be visiting at this time, especially since I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door, and there, resting on the doorstep, was a plain envelope. No return address, no markings, just a simple, unmarked envelope. My heart began to race a little as I bent down to pick it up. It felt oddly heavy for something so small. With a mix of curiosity and caution, I tore it open. Inside, I found a single photograph. At first, I didn't recognize it, but then my eyes scanned the image more carefully. It was a picture of my family from years ago, a memory I hadn't thought about in a long time. My parents, my siblings, and me standing together in front of our old house, laughing. The photo was faded, the colors muted by time, but there was no doubt that it was us. What struck me as odd, though, was how perfectly the photograph was preserved. It looked as though it had been taken only yesterday, despite the fact that it had been years since it was taken. I turned it over, hoping to find a note, but the back of the photo was blank. I felt a chill run through me as I stood there holding the photograph. Who would send me this? How had they gotten it? My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a prank, but it didn't feel like one. The photo itself felt too personal, too intimate to be just some joke. I thought about the people I had kept in touch with over the years, but none of them would have sent something like this. I couldn't even imagine what motive they could have for sending a picture from my past. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I set the photograph down on the kitchen table and walked to the living room to sit down. I needed to think, to make sense of this strange event. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more questions popped up. Why had they chosen this particular photograph? What was the significance? And most importantly, who had sent it? It wasn't like I had any contact with anyone from that time anymore. My parents had moved away, and I had lost touch with my siblings over the years. My closest friends from that time had all drifted out of my life as well. There was no one who could explain this. As I sat there, staring at the photograph, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. There, in the background of the picture, just barely visible, was a figure. A shadow that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just the result of poor lighting or a trick of the camera. But as I leaned in closer, I saw it clearly. A person, someone I didn't recognize, standing off to the side, almost blending in with the shadows of the house. They were staring directly at the camera, though their face was mostly hidden. Their posture was stiff and unnatural, almost as if they were waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I couldn't remember anyone being there that day, and I certainly didn't recall anyone looking at the camera like that. The realization that someone had been in that photo, someone I didn't recognize, struck me with a wave of nausea. How had they gotten into that moment in time, in my family's life? How had they even known where to find the photograph in the first place? It didn't make any sense. I had kept my family memories locked away, stored safely in old boxes and photo albums. There was no way someone could have gotten access to them unless they'd been inside my house. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I stood up, pacing around the room. The photograph felt like it was watching me, as if the person in the background was still there, following me. I had to know more. I realized I couldn't just let this go without understanding who had sent this, why they had sent it, and what they wanted. My mind began to race with all the possibilities. Had someone been in my home? Had I missed something? The idea that someone could have been watching me from the shadows was enough to send my heart pounding in my chest. I thought about checking my locks, looking around the house for any sign of forced entry, but I was afraid of what I might find. What if the person in the photo was still here, waiting for me to discover them? Instead, I took the photograph and drove to my parents' house, hoping they could shed some light on it. I needed answers. When I arrived, I handed the photo to my mother and asked if she remembered anything about the day it was taken. Her face went pale as she studied the picture. She had a look of confusion at first, but then something shifted in her eyes. She looked at me, then back at the photo, her face draining of color. She seemed almost too afraid to speak. After a long pause, she looked up at me and said, "There's something wrong with that picture." I stared at her, unable to understand. "What do you mean? It's just a photo of all of us." "No," she said, her voice trembling. "That's not the photo I remember. The day we took that picture, there was no one else there. We were the only ones at the house." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean, no one else?" She took a deep breath and told me a story I had never heard before. That day, as they were taking pictures, a man had come to the front door. He was looking for someone my parents didn't know, and he had a strange air about him. He kept insisting he had been invited, though no one in the house recognized him. After a tense moment, he had left, and they thought nothing of it. But now, looking at the picture, my mother noticed something she hadn't seen before: his silhouette in the background, standing just out of view, watching us all. I felt my blood run cold as the pieces started to fall into place. The man in the photo, the one I hadn't recognized, had been there all along. And now, years later, he was sending me this photograph, reminding me of his presence, his watching eyes. I realized then that it wasn't just a photograph. It was a warning. The person who had sent it knew more about my family than they should, and they were still out there, still lurking in the shadows. I left my parents' house that day with a heavy heart, clutching the photo in my hands. Whatever this was, whatever game was being played, it wasn't over. And I had a feeling it wouldn't be until I uncovered the truth. I couldn't shake the feeling that this photograph was just the beginning of something much darker. Story 14. Someone left a trail of breadcrumbs leading to my front door. It was odd enough that I didn't notice it at first, but as I stepped outside to retrieve the mail, I saw them scattered along the path that led up to my porch. The small, uneven pieces of bread were placed with strange precision, almost like a trail, though no one had been around when I checked earlier. I thought it was a prank, maybe from one of my neighbors, but it didn't sit right with me. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. As if something wasn't just weird, it felt intentional. I hesitated for a moment, standing on my porch and staring at the breadcrumbs. The way they were arranged was almost like a pattern, yet they didn't make any sense. I hadn't seen anyone walking around my yard recently. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets empty, and no one had mentioned anything about strange behavior. Who would do something so odd? I knelt down to inspect them more closely, wondering if they were fresh or had been left there for some time. The faint smell of stale bread hit me as I picked one up, and that's when it hit me this wasn't just a random joke. I quickly looked around, half expecting to see someone watching from a distance, but the street was still. No cars, no people, just an eerie silence. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A deep sense of unease settled in my chest. It was as if the breadcrumbs were leading me somewhere, and the thought that they could be leading to my door made my stomach churn. I couldn't just ignore it. I grabbed a broom from inside and swept the breadcrumbs off the porch, trying to make it all feel normal again. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I locked all the doors and checked the windows, ensuring everything was secure. But even with the house fully locked, I couldn't quiet the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. The breadcrumbs felt like a warning, like someone was trying to send me a message, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Who would leave a trail to my doorstep? And why? I told myself it was probably nothing, just a weird coincidence, but I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in my head that told me something was wrong. The next morning, I went about my routine as usual, but the breadcrumbs had left their mark on my mind. When I stepped outside again to grab the mail, I froze. There, once more, was another trail of breadcrumbs leading up to my front door. The exact same pattern, arranged with meticulous care. My breath caught in my throat. I had swept everything clean the night before. There was no way anyone could have gotten close without me noticing. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I bent down to inspect the breadcrumbs again, my hands shaking slightly as I touched them. They were fresh this time, the crumbs still soft and sticky. Whoever had left them had been here recently. I quickly scanned the yard and the street, but there was no one in sight. It was like the person who had left them had vanished into thin air. The trail didn't make any sense. Why breadcrumbs? Why my front door? I decided it was time to call the police, though I wasn't sure how to explain the situation. Someone left breadcrumbs on my porch didn't seem like much of an emergency. But when I relayed the details to the officer on the phone, I was surprised at their response. They didn't dismiss it as trivial. Instead, they told me they'd send someone over to take a look. A short while later, 2 officers arrived at my house, looking as puzzled as I felt. They walked around the porch, inspecting the breadcrumbs with the same unease that I had felt earlier. One of the officers even bent down to pick up a piece, holding it between his fingers. "This is strange," he muttered. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing. This isn't a random prank." They asked me a few questions, whether I had noticed anything out of the ordinary lately, or if I had any enemies. I told them no. I was just a regular person, living in a quiet neighborhood. The officers promised to investigate, but they left just as uncertain as I had been. They collected a few pieces of the breadcrumbs for evidence, though I had no idea how that would help. What could breadcrumbs tell them? It all felt so bizarre, like I was caught in the middle of some kind of twisted game. I thanked them and closed the door behind me, locking it as I went inside. But as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, waiting, watching. The breadcrumbs were more than just a strange coincidence, they were a warning. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept hearing noises from outside my window. Soft rustling sounds like footsteps on dry leaves. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just the wind or a passing animal. But I couldn't help but feel paranoid. My mind kept returning to the breadcrumbs. They had been left there on purpose, and whoever had left them clearly knew where I lived. I had never felt more vulnerable in my own home. I fell into a restless sleep, but the feeling of unease never quite left me. The next morning when I stepped outside, I was prepared for the worst. Sure enough, there was another trail of breadcrumbs leading to my front door. This time, the trail didn't stop at the porch. It led up the steps and right to the door. Someone had been watching me sleep. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the extent of it. Whoever was behind this knew when I was home and when I was inside. The realization hit me hard, like a punch to the gut. I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay here anymore, not with this haunting trail of breadcrumbs reappearing each day. I called a friend to come stay with me, and together we packed up my most important belongings. I couldn't explain why I felt so urgently that I needed to leave, but the breadcrumbs had shown me that I wasn't safe. I couldn't live in a house where someone was watching me so closely. As I drove away from my home that day, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road was empty. No one was behind me, no one was watching. It was only then that I allowed myself to breathe, to feel a slight relief, knowing that I had escaped. But I still wondered, what did the breadcrumbs mean? And who had left them? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for certain: I would never return to that house. Whoever had been leaving those breadcrumbs was still out there, and I wasn't going to take any chances. Story 15. I was just finishing up my yard work when I noticed something strange lying near the edge of my backyard. I had been trimming the bushes and tidying up the garden all afternoon, the sun slowly sinking behind the horizon. At first, it seemed like just another piece of trash that had blown in from somewhere. But as I walked closer, I saw that it was a wine bottle. An empty wine bottle. This wouldn't have been strange, except for one thing: I don't drink. In fact, I never have. I stood there for a moment, staring at the bottle. It was clear, dark glass with the label still intact, though the words were faded from years of wear. It looked like a high-quality bottle, the kind that people would have gotten from a vineyard or a special occasion. But why would it be here, in my backyard, completely empty? I couldn't recall anyone visiting recently who might have brought it, and I certainly hadn't been the one to drink from it. My first thought was that maybe someone had tossed it over the fence. Maybe a neighbor's child had decided to get rid of it, or perhaps it had been left behind by a guest I hadn't seen in a while. But that explanation didn't sit right with me. The bottle was too far into my yard, tucked behind some shrubs where it wouldn't have been visible from the street. It was almost as if someone had deliberately placed it there. I picked up the bottle, turning it over in my hands. It was completely dry, the inside as clean as if it had been washed out. No spills, no remnants of wine, nothing that suggested it had been casually discarded. As I inspected it, a faint smell lingered in the air, but it wasn't the sweet scent of wine. It was something sour, like something had been in the bottle for a while, slowly evaporating. I frowned, confused. The whole thing felt off, like it was a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. I walked around the yard, looking for any other signs that something unusual had happened. But there was nothing. No footprints in the grass, no broken branches, no signs of anyone having been there recently. It was as if the bottle had appeared out of nowhere. And the more I thought about it, the stranger it became. Who could have left it there? Why hadn't I noticed it earlier? It didn't make sense. As I continued to stand there, trying to wrap my mind around the situation, a sudden cold breeze rustled the leaves above me. I shivered, despite the warm weather. It wasn't just the chill in the air, it was the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like I was being watched. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe it was the strange bottle that had triggered something inside me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a random oddity. I walked back inside, still holding the bottle, and set it down on the kitchen counter. I couldn't get rid of it. Part of me wanted to just toss it in the trash and forget about it, but something told me I should keep it, as if it were a clue, a piece of evidence that I wasn't seeing yet. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like this bottle was a warning. A warning about something I wasn't aware of, something that had been happening right under my nose. For the next few days, I kept an eye on the backyard. I thought maybe I'd see someone coming by, maybe someone who had left the bottle behind, but nothing happened. The yard remained quiet and still, as it always had. But the unease lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about that bottle, about how out of place it felt. I began to wonder if there was something more to this than I was able to understand. I mentioned it to a few close friends, but they all brushed it off, saying it was probably just an accident or a prank. "You're overthinking it," one of them said. "It's just a bottle someone tossed out." But I couldn't let it go. Something about it didn't sit right with me. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that it wasn't just a coincidence. One evening, a week later, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. I needed to clear my head, to get out of the house and distract myself from the constant nagging thoughts. As I walked past my neighbor's house, I noticed something strange. There, on the edge of their yard, was another wine bottle, identical to the one I had found in my own backyard. It was lying in the grass, the same dark glass and the same faded label. I felt my heart race as I approached it. I looked around, but no one was in sight. I picked up the bottle, holding it in my hand, and examined it closely. It was identical to the one I had found. It wasn't a prank, this was real. Someone had placed this bottle here just like the one in my yard. I began to feel a growing sense of dread. Why were these bottles appearing? What was the significance of them? I had never seen anything like this before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something I didn't fully understand. I took the bottle back to my house, setting it next to the one I had found earlier. 2 bottles, both identical, both empty, both somehow connected. That night I stayed up late, my mind racing. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about what I had found. It felt like I was on the edge of something, like there was a mystery I needed to solve before it was too late. The bottles seemed like a warning, but what were they warning me about? And who was leaving them? In the morning, I decided to do something I hadn't thought of before I looked up the address of my neighbor's house. I didn't know them very well, but I needed answers. I needed to understand what was going on. As I searched online, I found something unsettling. The house next door had a history. A strange history. Years ago, the previous owners had disappeared without a trace. No one knew what had happened to them, and the house had stood empty for months before my neighbors moved in. I stared at the screen, a chill running down my spine. Could there be a connection between the bottles and the disappearance? Could someone be trying to send a message through these strange, cryptic bottles? I didn't know, but I knew one thing: I couldn't ignore this anymore. I walked back outside, my gaze scanning the backyard one more time. The bottles were still there, lying innocently on the counter, but they felt heavy with meaning now. Someone had left them there for a reason, and I had to figure out why. I didn't know where this strange path would lead, but I knew I had to follow it, no matter how unsettling it might be. Something was waiting for me, and I was determined to find out what. Story 16. I had just finished my late-night work, the room lit only by the soft glow of my desk lamp and the screen of my laptop. The house was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of trees outside my window. I had been so absorbed in what I was doing that I didn't notice the low hum at first. It wasn't until I stood up to stretch and glanced out the window that I saw it. A drone, hovering just outside, barely visible against the dark sky. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The drone was small, hovering perfectly still just a few feet from the window. I couldn't make out any details except for the faint, blinking lights on its underside. It didn't seem like the kind of drone someone would casually fly for fun. It was too close, too deliberate, and it was too late for someone to be out flying drones around. My heart began to beat faster, the unease creeping up my spine. For a moment I thought about grabbing my phone and calling the authorities, but what would I say? Someone's flying a drone outside my window. It sounded absurd. Still, the longer I stood there, watching the drone, the more uncomfortable I became. There was something wrong about it, something that made me feel like I wasn't just being watched, but hunted. I quickly shut the blinds, hoping that would block any view of me, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I went back to my desk and tried to shake off the incident, but my thoughts kept returning to the drone. What was it doing? Who was controlling it? I had never seen anything like this before, and I couldn't stop wondering if it was just a random occurrence or something more deliberate. I tried to focus on my work again, but it was difficult. Every time I glanced toward the window, I half expected to see that blinking light again, but the room remained quiet and still. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the thought of that drone. I started to become paranoid, looking out my windows every time I heard a hum or saw a shadow move. But there was nothing, no more drones, no more strange occurrences. For a while, I convinced myself that it had been a one-time thing, a fluke, a trick of the mind. But then, a few nights later, I heard it again. This time the sound was louder, more distinct. I immediately knew what it was. The drone was back. I rushed to the window, but it was too late. The drone had already moved away, disappearing into the night. My heart was racing, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I couldn't keep ignoring it. Someone was watching me, and I had no idea who or why. The next day, I decided to do something about it. I installed a security camera by my window, hoping to catch any activity if the drone returned. I didn't know if it would help, but at least it would give me some peace of mind. Over the next few nights, I kept a close eye on the camera feed. Nothing. No drones. I started to feel foolish, like maybe I had overreacted. But then, just as I was beginning to relax, I received an email. The subject line simply read, "I'm watching." I hesitated for a moment before opening it, and what I saw made my stomach drop. It was a photo of my bedroom window, taken from the outside, the same window where I had seen the drone. The caption underneath read, "You can't hide." There was no other explanation, no details. Just a chilling image of my window and a reminder that someone was out there, watching. I immediately checked the security footage from the camera I had installed. The drone hadn't returned, but there was something else in the footage that made my blood run cold. At the exact moment I had received the email, the camera had picked up a shadow moving outside the window just for a brief second. Whoever had taken that photo had been standing right outside, watching me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The drone wasn't the only way they were monitoring me. For the next few days, I stayed in a constant state of anxiety. I didn't know who was watching me or why, but I knew that it wasn't just a harmless prank. Whoever was doing this had been planning it. They knew my routines, they knew when I was home, and they were willing to go to great lengths to make sure I knew I was being watched. The worst part was that I had no way of knowing how long it had been going on. Was the drone the first time? Had they been watching me for longer? I reached out to a few friends and family members, telling them about what had been happening. They were supportive, but they didn't seem to fully understand the gravity of the situation. Most of them told me to relax, to stop worrying, that it was probably just someone messing around. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. One afternoon, I decided to take a more proactive approach. I went outside and circled my house, looking for any sign of the drone or any other surveillance equipment. I searched the yard, the trees, the roof. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't help but feel that I was being watched from somewhere. The longer I stayed outside, the more paranoid I became, and eventually I gave up and went back inside. That night, after I went to bed, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. I kept hearing noises strange, faint sounds like something moving just outside my window. The house felt unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that feels suffocating. And then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it. The hum of a drone. It was distant at first, but it quickly grew louder, closer. My heart stopped in my chest. The drone was back. I grabbed my phone and checked the security camera feed, but the feed was frozen. The camera had gone offline, just as I had heard the drone. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Whoever was watching me had somehow disabled the camera, cutting off the only line of defense I had. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my keys, and ran outside, hoping to confront whoever was out there. When I reached the backyard, I saw it. The drone hovering just above the ground, its lights blinking softly in the darkness. But there was something different about it this time. It wasn't moving, just hovering in place as though waiting for me. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, the drone suddenly powered up, its lights flashing in a rapid sequence. It was almost like a warning, and before I could react, it took off into the sky, disappearing into the night. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The drone was gone, but the fear still lingered. I knew now that whoever had been watching me wasn't just some random stranger. They were sending a message, a warning. And the worst part was that I didn't know who they were or what they wanted. From that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was never truly alone. Even as I went about my daily routine, there was always the nagging thought in the back of my mind that someone, somewhere, was watching. The drone had been just the beginning, and I had no idea what would come next. Story 17. Someone left a single glove on my front porch with a note that read, "The other one is mine." I had just returned from work, carrying my grocery bags and tired from the long day. As I walked up the steps to my front door, I noticed the glove sitting on the doormat. At first, I thought it was some sort of misplaced item, perhaps dropped by a delivery person or a neighbor. But as I got closer, the note attached to the glove caught my eye, its simple words unsettling me in a way I couldn't explain. I bent down and picked up the glove, feeling its soft fabric between my fingers. It was an ordinary-looking black leather glove, but there was something about it that made my stomach churn. I had no idea who it could belong to, or why it had been left on my porch. I glanced around the street, but there was no one in sight. The neighborhood was quiet as usual, the sun beginning to set, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I stood there for a moment, staring at the glove in my hand, wondering what it meant. The note was short but chilling, its words clear and precise. "The other one is mine." The message was simple, but it felt like a warning. I had no idea what it meant or who could have left it. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and I didn't have any enemies or strange acquaintances who would leave cryptic notes on my doorstep. My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Who would leave a single glove? And why say that the other one was theirs? I took the note inside, still holding the glove, and locked the door behind me. My house felt unusually quiet, the air thick with tension. I set the glove down on the kitchen table and tried to think. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was just some weird, harmless joke from a friend or a neighbor. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. The note seemed deliberate, almost as if someone was watching me, waiting for me to notice it. I called my best friend, hoping she could offer some perspective. After explaining everything to her, she remained silent for a moment before responding. "That's strange," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "I don't know anyone who would do something like that, but maybe you should be careful. It sounds a little creepy." Her words did nothing to calm my nerves. If anything, they made the situation feel even more real, more threatening. I spent the rest of the evening staring at the glove, my mind racing with possibilities. Was someone trying to send me a message? Was this some sort of warning? I had no idea. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that was slowly creeping into my bones, but it was impossible. The glove and the note were haunting me, lingering in my thoughts even as I tried to distract myself with other things. That night, I double-checked all the locks on my doors and windows before going to bed. I felt a sense of unease that I couldn't shake off, and every little sound seemed amplified in the stillness of my home. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer than usual, and I kept imagining that I could hear footsteps outside my window. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was probably nothing, but the fear refused to leave me. The next morning I woke up late for work and rushed to get ready. As I opened the front door, I froze. There on the doormat was another glove this time. It was a matching one to the first. My heart skipped a beat as I bent down to pick it up. The leather was the same, and the note was still attached, this time reading, "We're almost there." I felt the color drain from my face as I held the glove in my hand, the terror rising in my chest. I quickly slammed the door shut and backed away from the entrance, my mind racing. This wasn't a joke anymore. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me, leaving these gloves as some sort of twisted message. But who? And why? I thought back to the past few days, trying to think of anyone who might have had access to my porch or my house. But nothing came to mind. I had no idea who would go to such lengths to leave a single glove, and then a matching one with an even more cryptic note. My fear intensified as I realized that whoever was behind this was trying to send me a message, but I still had no idea what it meant. I decided to call the police, hoping they could make sense of it. The officer who answered took down my details and assured me that they would send someone over to investigate. I didn't know what they could do, but I felt a slight sense of relief knowing that I had taken some action. Later that afternoon, a police officer arrived at my door. I showed him the gloves and the notes, and he examined them carefully. After a few moments of silence, he looked up at me with a serious expression. "This is unusual," he said. "It could be a prank, but we'll have to keep an eye on things. You should stay alert and report anything suspicious." I nodded, but his words did little to ease the fear gnawing at me. I wanted to believe that it was all just some strange coincidence, but deep down I knew that it wasn't. The gloves, the notes, the feeling that I was being watched, it all felt too deliberate, too sinister. The officer left soon after, reminding me to stay vigilant and to let him know if anything else happened. That evening, I decided to stay in, not wanting to be outside in case the person responsible came back. I locked all the windows and doors, drawing the blinds and turning off all the lights. I felt safer in the darkness, but the nagging sense of dread remained. I didn't know what would happen next, or who was behind this strange game, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let my guard down. The gloves and the notes had crossed a line, and I wouldn't rest until I figured out who was doing this and why. As the days passed, the strange messages continued. Gloves appeared on my porch, each with a new note, each more cryptic than the last. But eventually the gloves stopped coming. The messages stopped. The fear that had consumed my every thought began to fade, but I could never forget the eerie feeling that someone had been watching me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make their presence known. To this day, I don't know who left the gloves or what their intentions were. All I know is that I was never the same after that. The fear of being watched, the fear of the unknown, stayed with me long after the gloves were gone. And though I moved on with my life, I couldn't help but wonder, what if the person behind those gloves was still out there, watching, waiting? Story 18. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when I found the map. I was heading to the mailbox to grab the usual stack of bills and junk mail, just another routine in my day. But as I reached for the handle, something caught my eye. A small, folded piece of paper was taped to the side of the mailbox just above the flap. It looked like it had been hastily stuck there, as if it had been placed by someone who didn't want to be noticed. I pulled it off carefully, feeling an odd sense of unease creep up my spine. Unfolding the paper, I saw a handwritten map of my neighborhood. It was simple but detailed. Every street, every corner, and even the park nearby were marked with dark ink. My house was clearly highlighted, along with a few other houses around mine. At first I thought it might be some sort of mistake or wrong delivery, or a confused neighbor trying to show directions, but then I noticed something chilling. There were red X placed over certain houses, including mine. My heart started to race, and I felt a cold shiver run down my back. What was this map for? Who had made it, and why was it left here? I stood there for a moment, staring at the map in disbelief. I didn't know what to think. I quickly glanced around, hoping to spot someone nearby who might have seen me find it. The street was empty, and the neighborhood seemed as quiet as ever. No one was walking their dog, no cars were parked along the curb, just the stillness of the afternoon. I felt exposed, like I was being watched, but I couldn't see anyone. I tucked the map into my pocket and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. Once I was inside, I sat down at the kitchen table, the map still crumpled in my hands. I tried to make sense of it, looking at the lines and markings. Each X was circled, as if highlighting a specific location. Some of the markings were right next to houses, while others were near the park or the street corners. As I studied it, my mind raced with questions. Who would do something like this? And why would my house be marked? I tried to brush it off as some kind of prank, maybe a strange neighborhood game or something. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a joke. Something about the map felt intentional. The way the markings were made, the specific focus on certain houses, it all felt too precise. I felt like I was on the edge of something unsettling, something I couldn't explain. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time a car passed by or a noise echoed outside, I found myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, watching me. I didn't dare tell anyone about the map, not yet. I didn't want to sound paranoid or overreact. But as the hours passed, I grew more and more anxious. My mind kept going back to the red X. What did they mean? Why was my house marked? The next morning, I went for a walk, trying to clear my mind. I didn't want to let the map control me, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. As I walked through the neighborhood, I couldn't help but notice that the X on the map seemed to correspond with the layout of the streets. The houses with marks on them were the ones that stood out, ones with big yards, well-kept gardens, and families who had lived there for years. But as I passed each house, nothing seemed unusual. No one was acting strange, no lights were flickering, and the people going about their day seemed normal. Still, the feeling of dread wouldn't leave me. Over the next few days, I kept an eye on my neighborhood, trying to see if anything odd was happening. I looked out for unfamiliar faces or strange behavior, but there was nothing to indicate anything was wrong. However, I began to notice something else. The red X on the map weren't just random. They were starting to line up in a way that suggested a pattern. It was as if they were pointing toward something, toward a particular spot in the neighborhood. But what could it be? That afternoon, I decided to follow the map's markings to see where they led. I started with the house closest to mine that had an X over it. It was an old Victorian-style home with ivy creeping up the sides. As I walked past, I saw that the windows were dark and the door was slightly ajar, which struck me as strange. No one lived there as far as I knew, but something about the open door felt off. I stepped back, hesitating, but eventually walked away. I moved on to the next house, which was even more unsettling. There was a car parked in the driveway, but no one was around. The house seemed too quiet, too still, as if the people inside were waiting for something. I felt my stomach twist with unease, but I kept moving. The further I went, the more connected the houses seemed. Every X on the map led me to another house, and each one felt stranger than the last. The air around me felt heavier, like I was walking through a fog that only I could see. I had to know where this was leading, so I pushed forward, despite my growing discomfort. Finally, I reached the last location marked on the map. It was an old, overgrown lot at the end of the street, hidden behind a row of trees. The map had marked an X right in the center of the lot, and as I stood there, staring at the thick brush and weeds, I felt a strange sense of finality. Whatever the map had been leading me to, it was here. I took a deep breath and stepped into the lot, pushing through the overgrown plants. As I reached the middle, something on the ground caught my eye. It was a small, rusty object partially buried in the dirt. I bent down to pick it up, and my heart stopped when I realized what it was. It was a key, old, weathered, and engraved with a symbol I didn't recognize. My fingers trembled as I held the key in my hand. I felt like I had uncovered something far deeper than I was prepared for. The map, the markings, the exit was all connected. But what did this key unlock? What was I being led to? I had no answers, only more questions, and the feeling that I was being drawn into something I couldn't escape from. I looked back toward the street, the familiar houses now looking more menacing, as if they were hiding secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. The key was a symbol of something, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to find out what it unlocked. I knew that whatever it was, I couldn't just leave it behind. Something told me that the map had been just the beginning. Story 19. The stranger asked me how my trip went, even though I had just returned from an unplanned vacation. I was standing in line at the coffee shop, minding my own business, when a man approached me. He was well dressed, mid-30s, with an expression I couldn't quite read. He didn't look like someone I knew, and yet he spoke to me like we had met before. "How did your trip go?" he asked, his voice casual, as if he were asking about a shared experience. I froze. I hadn't told anyone about the vacation. No one but a few close friends even knew I was leaving, and it wasn't planned in advance. I stared at him for a moment, trying to make sense of the situation. I didn't recognize his face, and I couldn't think of any reason why he would know about my trip. It had been spontaneous, something I had decided to do on a whim just a few days ago, with no time to tell many people. How could this man know? I forced myself to respond, my voice shaking slightly. "I'm sorry, have we met?" I asked, trying to figure out if he was just confused or playing some sort of prank on me. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, but I know all about it. The trip. How did you like the place? He continued, his tone still casual, but now there was something unsettling about it. He didn't wait for my response. Instead, he stepped back, giving me a brief nod before turning to leave the coffee shop. As he walked out, I stood there still processing his words. What was going on? How could he know? I hadn't posted anything about the trip, hadn't mentioned it to anyone except a few people close to me. I quickly paid for my coffee and left the shop, looking around for the stranger. But he was gone, vanished into the crowd. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the fact that he knew about my trip, it was the way he knew. There was no way he could have just guessed. And his calm, almost rehearsed demeanor made my skin crawl. It was like he had been expecting to see me, like he had been waiting for this moment. The rest of the day was a blur. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe I had mentioned it to someone else without remembering. But no matter how much I tried to explain it away, I couldn't forget the way the stranger spoke to me. It felt too personal, too precise. There was no reason he should have known, and yet he did. As the hours passed, I found myself checking over my shoulder, glancing nervously at every stranger I passed. Was I being watched? Was there someone else out there who knew more than I thought? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. The trip had been a spontaneous decision, just a few days away from everything, and it wasn't something I would have shared with anyone but the people closest to me. I checked my phone for any messages or notifications that might explain how the stranger knew, but nothing. No strange calls, no suspicious messages, just the usual stuff. My social media was quiet too, nothing out of the ordinary. So where had he gotten his information? A few days passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I left my house, I felt eyes on me, like someone was keeping track of my every move. I went to the store, and every time I glanced up, I thought I saw someone who looked like the stranger from the coffee shop. The same height, the same build, the same piercing, unblinking stare. But every time I tried to get a closer look, the person would disappear into the crowd. Then, one afternoon, I received a message that made my heart race. It was from an unknown number, and the message simply read, "I hope you enjoyed your trip." I dropped my phone, my hands trembling. How could they have known? Who was doing this to me? I had no answers, only the overwhelming feeling that something was terribly wrong. The stranger's words echoed in my mind. How had he known about the trip? Who had been watching me? The fact that he knew so much about me, even though I had told no one, made me feel vulnerable, exposed. I didn't know who to trust anymore. I debated calling the police, but I wasn't sure what I could tell them. How could I explain this strange encounter? How could I explain the growing sense of paranoia that was taking over my life? I didn't have any evidence, just a nagging feeling that someone was out there, watching me, tracking my every move. The days dragged on, each one more suffocating than the last. The sense of being followed, being watched, never left. Every little noise, every unfamiliar person set me on edge. I tried to go about my daily routine, but it felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. And then, one day, I found a note tucked under my door. It was simple, almost like the others, but this one had a different feeling to it. It read, "I know where you'll be tomorrow." I stood frozen, staring at the note, my mind racing. How could they know? What did they want from me? The questions swirled, but there were no answers. I had no idea who was behind it, and no idea how to stop it. The only thing I knew for certain was that I was no longer in control. Someone was watching. Someone knew more about me than I could ever understand, and I didn't know what to do next. Story 20. Bang. My phone started playing a voice recording of me having a conversation I didn't remember. I was sitting at my desk scrolling through my messages when suddenly, the sound of my own voice filled the room. It was coming from the speaker of my phone, clear and unmistakable, but the words were strange. I hadn't recorded anything, and certainly not a conversation. I froze, my fingers hovering over the screen, trying to make sense of what was happening. I looked at the call log, but there was no record of the call, no timestamp, nothing. Just the audio file labeled untitled. The voice on the recording was mine, but the conversation it was foreign to me. The voice seemed to be talking about things I hadn't thought of in years. Things that felt distant, like memories I had long buried. But it wasn't a memory, it was happening in real time on the recording, in a way that felt too real. I listened in silence, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. In the recording, I was speaking to someone I didn't recognize. Their voice was calm, almost soothing, but I couldn't place it. The conversation was about personal details, things I had never shared with anyone. "You've always had a tendency to push people away," the mysterious voice said. "It's why you're always alone." I felt my stomach churn. How could this voice know that about me? It was true, but it was something I had never openly discussed with anyone. I had kept it to myself, never letting anyone close enough to see that part of me. I quickly paused the recording, my breath shallow. What was happening? I looked at my phone again, searching for any explanation. There were no apps running, no indication of any recording software in use. And yet, the audio was there, clear and crisp, as if I had been speaking to someone just moments ago. I stared at the screen, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. Had someone hacked into my phone? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? I played the recording again, hoping that maybe I had missed something the first time. But this time I felt a cold rush of dread as I heard the voice again. "You've been ignoring the signs," it continued, "but you can't run from the truth." My heart began to pound in my chest. This wasn't just a random conversation, it felt like a warning. It felt personal. The voice seemed to know things about me that no one should know. I quickly deleted the file, my fingers trembling as I tapped the screen. But even as I deleted it, a feeling of unease settled deep in my bones. Something wasn't right. I had never recorded that conversation, and yet there it was. Had someone been watching me, listening to me? I checked my phone's settings, looking for any strange apps or permissions I didn't recognize, but everything seemed normal. Nothing unusual stood out. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next few days were filled with a growing sense of paranoia. I couldn't escape the feeling that someone was listening, that my phone wasn't as secure as I thought. I made sure to turn off the voice assistant, to disable any settings that might allow someone to access my phone remotely. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was still out there, watching, waiting. Then, a few days later, I received another voice recording. It wasn't from any number I recognized, and it didn't appear in my call log. It was the same voice, the same calm, unsettling tone. "You can't ignore it," the voice said. "You know you've been avoiding it." I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't told anyone about the first recording, so how could they know about it? How could they know what I was thinking, what I had been hiding? This time the voice sounded almost too familiar, as if it were mocking me. "You've always been good at pretending everything is fine," it continued. "But deep down, you know the truth." I tried to ignore it, to push it out of my mind, but the words lingered. How was this happening? Why was it happening? I couldn't get the voice out of my head. I began to keep my phone in a drawer when I wasn't using it, afraid to leave it out in case the recording came again. But no matter what I did, the voice kept returning, each message more cryptic, more personal than the last. It was as if the voice was inside my head, tapping into my deepest thoughts and fears. I started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. One night after the latest recording, I decided to do something I hadn't dared to do before. I called the number that had sent the message. I didn't expect anyone to answer, but I had to know. The phone rang once, twice, then a third time. I was about to hang up, thinking it was just a random number, when someone finally picked up. "Hello?" A woman's voice answered, calm and distant. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then the voice spoke again, this time with an eerie sense of familiarity. "You know who this is," she said, as if it were obvious. "You've been waiting for me." I felt my heart stop. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman on the other end laughed softly, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "What I want doesn't matter," she said. "What matters is that you finally understand. You've been running from yourself for too long." I slammed the phone down, my hands trembling. What was happening? How could this person know me so well? It was like they were inside my mind, reading my every thought. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get away, had to escape. I didn't know how long I had been running, how long I had been avoiding the truth, but it didn't matter. The voice had found me. It would never let me go. And as I sat there, my phone screen glowing in front of me, I knew that I couldn't hide from it anymore. The truth had already been revealed, and there was no escaping the consequences. Story 21. I woke up to find all the pictures on my walls turned upside down. At first I thought it was a mistake, maybe I had been sleepwalking and moved them without realizing. But as I examined the frames, I could see that each one had been carefully repositioned. It wasn't just one or two. Every single picture in my house, from the family photos to the paintings I had hung for decoration, was upside down. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing, trying to make sense of it. Who could have done this? And how? I checked the doors and windows, but they were all locked. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been in my home. I didn't have a roommate, and no one had been over the night before. The idea that I could have done it while I was asleep felt impossible. I always locked the doors before bed, and I had been alone in the house all evening. My mind raced as I thought of every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. I took down the first picture, a family portrait that had been hanging in the hallway for years. As I held it in my hands, something caught my eye. There was something different about the photo. The faces of my family members were slightly distorted, their expressions not quite right. It wasn't a major change, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. I looked closely at the other pictures, but they all had subtle differences too. The images seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. It felt like they were alive, watching me, waiting for something. I spent the rest of the morning trying to figure out what had happened. I called my best friend, thinking she might have played a prank on me, but she swore she hadn't been anywhere near my house. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I went about my day, I kept checking the pictures, but they remained upside down, each one a silent reminder of whatever had happened the night before. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That my pictures had been rearranged without any explanation. I couldn't even explain it to myself. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I noticed something even more unsettling. The pictures on the walls had shifted again. This time they weren't just upside down, they had been moved around. as though they were trying to form some kind of pattern. I walked from room to room, heart pounding in my chest, as I checked each one. In the living room, the picture of my late grandmother was now hanging in the kitchen, the frame slightly tilted as though it had been handled roughly. My favorite painting, one I'd bought on a trip abroad, was now in the bathroom, its frame crooked. It felt as if the entire house was shifting, rearranging itself in some way I couldn't understand. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed a bag and left, needing some space to think. I stayed at a friend's house for the next few days, hoping that when I returned, everything would be back to normal. But when I walked into my house, I was greeted by the same strange scene. Every picture was upside down again, each one more distorted than before. I could feel my heart racing as I stood in the doorway, staring at the walls, trying to comprehend what was happening. This time, however, something else had changed. The house felt different. It wasn't just the pictures. The air was heavier, thick with a sense of unease. I felt like I wasn't alone, like something was watching me from the shadows. I knew then that I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I packed up my things and left for good, moving into a new place with a fresh start. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the faces from those pictures twisted and distorted, staring back at me. And every now and then, when I walk into a room, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, like a shadow just a little too familiar. The pictures are gone, but whatever was behind them, it's still with me. Story 22. I was heading to work early one morning, ready for another long day of meetings and deadlines. As I approached my car, parked in the usual spot on the street, something immediately struck me as odd. There, on the side of my vehicle, was a small but noticeable mark. It wasn't a dent, and it wasn't a scratch. It was a smiley face, perfectly carved into the paint, as though someone had taken the time to etch it with care. I stood there for a moment, staring at it in disbelief, my heart racing. How could this happen? Who would do something like this to my car? I ran my hand over the mark, feeling the indented lines of the smiley face under my fingers. The car wasn't brand new, but it wasn't old either, and the paint was in decent condition. This engraving, however, was deep enough to expose the metal beneath, which meant someone had to have used something sharp, something deliberate. I looked around the neighborhood, half expecting to see someone hiding in the bushes or a suspicious figure nearby. But there was nothing. The street was empty, the morning fog still clinging to the sidewalks, and everything seemed unusually quiet. It didn't make sense. Why would anyone carve a smiley face into my car? I quickly got in, starting the engine and trying to shake off the feeling of unease. As I drove to work, my thoughts kept drifting back to the car. Was it a prank? Maybe, but it felt too strange, too intentional. I thought about the people I knew in the neighborhood, but no one came to mind who would do something like that. No one had ever shown any interest in my car, and I didn't have any enemies, at least none that I could think of. The smiley face seemed harmless enough, but there was something unsettling about it. It felt like a message, but what was it trying to say? When I arrived at work, I tried to focus on my tasks, but my mind kept wandering back to the mark on my car. It was hard to concentrate on anything else with the image of that smiley face stuck in my mind. Throughout the day, I found myself constantly checking the clock, eager to get back to the car and figure out what to do. By the time the workday ended, I could hardly wait to leave. When I arrived back at the parking lot, I walked quickly to my car, hoping the smiley face would somehow disappear, as if it had been a figment of my imagination. But when I rounded the corner, there it was, just as I had left it. The same deep carving in the side of my car, staring back at me with its simple, unsettling grin. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I checked the surrounding area again, but still there was no one in sight. It was then that I noticed something else. Near the smiley face, there was a small piece of paper wedged under the windshield wiper. I pulled it free, unfolding it carefully, almost afraid of what I might find. The paper was plain, unmarked, and without any text, just a small, strange symbol like an eye drawn in ink. My breath caught in my throat. What did it mean? Was this all connected? I looked around one more time, but the parking lot was still empty. No one seemed to be watching, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had never been someone to feel paranoid or anxious about things like this, but the smiley face and the mysterious symbol were starting to gnaw at me. Was it a prank? Or was there something more sinister behind it? The possibility that someone had been watching me, or knew something about me, made my stomach churn. It wasn't just the carving on the car, it was everything surrounding it. It didn't add up. For the next few days, I stayed vigilant. I inspected the car each time I got in, checking for any other strange marks or signs. Nothing new appeared, but the feeling of unease never quite left me. I couldn't stop thinking about the smiley face. Was it just a random act of vandalism, or was it a message, something more than I was able to understand? A week later, as I was getting into my car, I noticed something different. There was another piece of paper, once again under the windshield wiper. My hands shook slightly as I reached for it, unfolding it with care. This time the paper was slightly more detailed. There was a drawing of a small, narrow path leading into a forest, with a simple arrow pointing forward. No words, just the image. I stared at it, feeling a rising sense of dread. The path in the drawing was too specific. The forest. The arrow pointing forward. What was it trying to tell me? Was I supposed to follow it? My mind raced as I thought about the possibility of someone trying to lure me somewhere, or perhaps trying to get me to do something without realizing it. Was it a prank gone too far, or was there something more intentional behind it? After that, I began to notice other odd things happening. Little coincidences, or so I thought. I'd walk down the street and spot someone watching me from across the road, only for them to disappear as soon as I looked in their direction. The strange feeling of being followed became harder to ignore. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my head, that I was just being paranoid. But the smiley face, the paper with the eye, the symbol, and now this drawing of a forest path, they were all connected in ways I couldn't explain. The unease continued to grow, gnawing at me as I tried to go about my days. I didn't know who was behind it, or what they wanted from me, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't alone in this. It wasn't until one evening, weeks later, that I figured out the connection. I was flipping through an old journal of mine, something I hadn't looked at in years, when I stumbled across a drawing I had made during a road trip. The image was of a forest path, just like the one from the paper. I hadn't remembered drawing it, but there it was, in black and white, with an arrow pointing forward. The same image. It dawned on me then: the smiley face, the symbols, the strange drawings, they were all pointing me towards something. The final realization came when I noticed a small, folded note in the back of the journal. It was the same paper, the same texture as the ones that had appeared on my car. I opened it slowly, almost afraid of what I might find. Written inside was a single sentence: "You've been chosen." At that moment I understood. The smiley face wasn't a joke. It wasn't random. It was a message, and it was leading me somewhere toward something I couldn't yet comprehend. And now there was no turning back. Story 23. I had always been cautious about my mail, keeping track of every envelope that arrived at my doorstep. It was a simple routine: check the mailbox in the morning, bring everything inside, and sort through it: bills, advertisements, the occasional personal letter. But today was different. As I walked up to my front door, the mail that should have been there was scattered across the ground. A few envelopes lay by the door, while the rest were nowhere to be found. My heart started racing. Someone had clearly been through it. The tampering wasn't subtle, and it left me with an uncomfortable feeling in the pit of my stomach. I bent down to pick up the few envelopes that remained, each one clearly marked with the sender's name. But something was off. I noticed right away that there were fewer letters than there should have been. At first, I assumed I had made a mistake. Perhaps I had already brought the rest in earlier in the week. But that didn't explain the faint sense of unease I felt when I scanned the few items in front of me. The envelopes weren't torn or opened, but the contents were obviously missing. Whoever had done this had taken what they wanted and left the rest behind. I quickly went inside and started flipping through the few remaining letters. The bills seemed normal enough, but my eyes kept darting to the missing letters. A letter from my bank gone. A personal note from a friend missing as well. As I processed the situation, a chilling thought crossed my mind: what if this wasn't the first time? What if this had been happening for weeks, months even, and I simply hadn't noticed? I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it could be a mistake. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. This felt deliberate. Someone had been targeting me. I walked over to the window and pulled the blinds open to check the street, just in case the culprit was still nearby. I saw nothing out of the ordinary, no one loitering around or acting suspiciously. The street was as quiet as always, but the emptiness outside only made the situation feel more strange. Whoever had tampered with my mail had been careful, and they had done it without drawing attention. I knew this wasn't something random. Someone had been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. I decided to contact my local postal service to report the issue, but when I tried to dial their number, my phone line seemed to cut out. It was as if something was blocking my calls. Frustration began to build as I repeatedly tried and failed to reach anyone for help. I knew the mail had been tampered with, but I had no proof of who did it or how. I was left with a nagging fear that I was being watched, that whoever was behind this knew exactly what they were doing. What had they taken from me? What was their endgame? The next morning, I woke up with a strong resolve to get to the bottom of it. I wasn't going to let this go. I left my apartment early, driving to the post office in person to report what had happened. When I arrived, the clerk at the counter listened attentively, but seemed almost too calm about it. She took my details, confirmed that they would look into it, and assured me they would investigate further. I was left with more questions than answers. Something about her demeanor felt off, as if she knew more than she was letting on. Her eyes lingered a bit too long on me before she handed me a receipt, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. I left the post office, but the dread didn't fade. Over the next few days, I began paying closer attention to everything. I checked my mailbox twice a day, scrutinizing every letter that came through. As the days passed, more letters started to arrive, but there were still significant gaps: important items missing, personal notes vanishing as though they had never existed. Whoever was doing this had to be very careful, because they had never left a trace behind. I couldn't help but wonder if they were aware of my every move. Could they be watching me as I went through the motions of my day? The paranoia began to take root in my mind. I started feeling like I was being followed every time I stepped outside, even when there was no one in sight. My apartment seemed quieter, more oppressive, like I was never really alone. I kept double-checking my locks, making sure every window was secure. But still, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. The mail was just the beginning, I realized. Something far worse was coming. One evening, about a week after the first tampering incident, I was sitting in my living room when I heard a soft knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, I stood up and approached the door, peering through the peephole. No one was there. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the door, and to my surprise, there was a letter resting on the doormat. I quickly snatched it up, scanning it for any sign of the sender. It was just an ordinary envelope with no markings or distinguishing features. I opened it carefully, my stomach turning as I did. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar. The note simply read, "You're being watched. It'll make it worse." My blood ran cold as I reread the message. The handwriting was so distinct, so deliberate, that it left no room for doubt. Whoever had been tampering with my mail was now escalating things. They were sending me a direct warning, and I had no idea who they were or what they wanted from me. I immediately called the police, though I was unsure of what I could tell them. How could I explain this? How could I make them understand that someone had been infiltrating my personal life without any physical evidence? When the officer arrived, I showed him the note. He nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. He advised me to be cautious, to report any further incidents, but there was little else he could do without evidence. My sense of security had been shattered. The following week, the final straw came. I was sitting in my living room when I noticed something odd. The window was open. I always kept it locked, but somehow the latch had been undone. Panic surged through me as I rushed over to close it. When I turned back to the room, I saw that my desk drawer was open. My heart sank. Whoever had been watching me had crossed the line. They had been in my apartment. They had been here, in my private space, and I hadn't even noticed. I didn't wait any longer. I packed a bag, grabbed a few essentials, and left my apartment. I stayed with a friend for a few nights while I tried to figure out what to do next. It was clear that whoever had been tampering with my mail and invading my privacy wasn't going to stop. They were still out there, lurking, watching, waiting. And I had no choice but to disappear for a while, to escape before they could do worse. The fear that had gripped me from the start had now taken full hold. I knew I couldn't go back until I was certain that the person who had been watching me had finally given up. Story 24. A person in a hoodie lingered outside my apartment building for hours without coming inside. I first noticed them around noon, standing just outside the entrance, their face hidden under the hood, only their silhouette visible against the gray sky. At first, I thought nothing of it. People stood outside buildings all the time, waiting for someone, perhaps checking their phone, or just lost in thought. But as the minutes turned into hours, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't normal for someone to stand there, motionless, for so long without a purpose. I tried to ignore it, and went about my day. But each time I glanced out the window, the person was still there, unmoving, like a figure frozen in time. It was unsettling, like they were watching the building, or waiting for something. Every time I thought about going outside, something held me back. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this person knew something I didn't, or perhaps they were waiting for me. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to distract myself with work, but the image of that hooded figure standing there lingered in my mind. Around 4 p.m., I decided to head to the store to grab some essentials. As I opened my front door, I saw the figure again, standing in the same spot, their posture still as rigid as before. I froze for a moment, my heart skipping a beat. What was this person doing? Why hadn't they moved? I took a deep breath and told myself not to overthink it. That maybe they were just waiting for a friend, or perhaps they lived in the building and were on a break. Still, there was an undeniable tension in the air. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped out, trying to act normal. But my every move felt like it was under a microscope. As I walked toward the store, I couldn't help but glance back. The person in the hoodie was still standing there. They hadn't moved an inch. It was like they were standing watch, as if they were waiting for something or someone. I quickened my pace, my unease growing with each step. When I returned an hour later, the person was still there, though now they were sitting on the ground, their knees pulled up to their chest. It was as if time had stopped for them, while it had continued for everyone else. I felt a chill run down my spine. The situation was starting to feel more than just strange. It felt almost deliberate, as if they were waiting for something specific to happen. I called a friend to talk about it, but they dismissed my concerns, suggesting it was just a person minding their own business. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was the persistence of it, the way they stood or sat there without moving, day after day. That night I couldn't sleep, the thought of the figure outside haunting me. I checked the window multiple times, but they were still there, sitting motionless, like a shadow on the street. How could they not be cold? How could they be so still for so long? The next day the person was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the sense of unease lingered. What had they been doing here all that time? Why hadn't they gone inside the building? It wasn't until I went to check my mail later that I realized something wasn't right. As I walked to the mailbox, I noticed that the door to the building was slightly ajar. I froze, my blood running cold. The door should have been locked. It always had been. I looked around, half expecting to see the person in the hoodie again, but there was no one. I stepped back cautiously, not daring to approach. My heart raced. Someone had tampered with the lock. Someone had gotten in. The feeling of dread grew in the pit of my stomach as I backed away from the door. I didn't know what had been happening outside my apartment, but something was definitely wrong. The thought of that person in the hoodie, standing there for hours, suddenly felt much more sinister. What were they waiting for? Why had they never entered the building? And what had they done while I wasn't watching? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Later that evening, I decided to stay with a friend, afraid to return to my apartment. When I did return the next day, I found that nothing had been taken, nothing had been disturbed. Everything appeared to be exactly as I had left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was still out there. The strange thing was, I never saw the person in the hoodie again. They had vanished without a trace, leaving me with nothing but a lingering sense of dread and unanswered questions. I couldn't stop thinking about the strange figure who had stood outside for hours. Were they watching for someone, waiting for a moment to slip inside? Or was it something even darker, something I couldn't understand? Whatever it was, I was left with more questions than answers, and I never saw the person in the hoodie again. But the thought of them standing there, motionless, outside my apartment, still haunted me long after they were gone. Story 25. I was sorting through the pile of mail one evening when a letter caught my attention. It wasn't addressed in a typical way. There was no return address, no name, just my address written in bold, hurried handwriting. My first instinct was to throw it away, thinking it was just another piece of junk mail or something from a company trying to sell me something. But for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly in half. I unfolded it, and the first thing I saw was a message written in dark ink: "I know your secret." I froze. The words seemed to jump off the page, each letter carved into my mind as if it were a warning. I stared at them for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest. The note didn't say anything more. There was no signature, no other explanation, just those 5 chilling words. My mind raced. What secret could they be referring to? I had never told anyone anything particularly private, or so I thought. I was always careful, always guarded. I had a small circle of friends, no one I would consider an enemy, and no reason to believe anyone would have a reason to harm me. But there was a nagging feeling in my gut, one that told me I couldn't ignore this letter. Someone knew something, and they weren't going to let me forget it. I spent the next few hours trying to calm myself down. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just a prank, a mistake, or some weird coincidence. But nothing seemed to make sense. I searched the house, checking every window, every door, looking for signs of anything strange or out of place. But everything seemed normal, at least on the surface. Still, the words from the letter kept echoing in my mind, and the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. The next morning, I decided to take the letter to the police. Maybe it was nothing, but I wasn't going to take any chances. I handed it over to an officer, explaining everything I could, but he only seemed mildly concerned. "It could be a prank," he said, "or it could be something more serious. We'll look into it." I left feeling unsatisfied. I wanted answers, not vague reassurances. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had sent the letter was watching me, waiting for something. I became hyper-aware of every little thing around me. The way the curtains moved when there was no breeze. The sound of footsteps outside my door when no one was there. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't help it. I began to check over my shoulder whenever I went outside, convinced someone was lurking just out of sight. Days passed, and nothing unusual happened, but the letter remained on my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about what it meant. I started to wonder if the letter was meant to intimidate me, to make me afraid of something I didn't even know about. But that idea didn't sit right with me. Whoever had sent it wasn't just trying to scare me, they were trying to manipulate me, to make me question everything. And that thought made me even more uneasy. I started keeping a journal, writing down every detail of my daily life in case something happened or I began to notice something strange. It became an obsession. I documented every phone call, every person I spoke to, every movement I made. It wasn't healthy, but it felt like the only way to regain some sense of control. One night, a week after I received the letter, I came home late from work. The house was dark and quiet, just the way I had left it. But when I walked into the kitchen, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The letter, the one I had carefully kept hidden away in a drawer, was sitting on the kitchen table. My heart stopped. I hadn't left it there. I was sure of it. I quickly scanned the room, my pulse racing. No one was there, nothing seemed out of place. But the letter was undeniable. It sat there, staring at me as if mocking me. I reached for it cautiously, half expecting something to happen. The paper felt cold in my hands, and I noticed that the ink was still the same dark shade as before. But this time, something was different. Beneath the original message, there was another sentence written in a different handwriting. "I'm closer than you think." I could feel my hands trembling as I read the words. A wave of panic washed over me. Who was doing this? How did they get into my house? I couldn't make sense of it. I thought about calling the police again, But what would I even say? I didn't have any evidence, just a note and a growing sense of dread. They would think I was paranoid, overreacting. I couldn't stay in the house that night. I needed to get out, to be somewhere safe, somewhere where I wouldn't feel like I was being watched. I grabbed my phone and went to stay with a friend, explaining what had been happening. I told them about the letter, about the strange feeling that someone was always nearby, waiting. They listened sympathetically but told me to calm down, that it was probably just some sick joke. But I knew it wasn't a joke. The feeling of being watched never left me no matter where I went. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up, my mind racing, going over every detail of the past few weeks. The letters, the strange occurrences, the sense that I was being followed. I tried to think back to any event, any person who might have a reason to do this, but nothing came to mind. There was no explanation, no clear connection to anything in my life. The thought of going back to my house was unbearable. I felt like a prisoner in my own skin. The next morning, I decided to return home. I couldn't stay away forever, no matter how much I wanted to. As I walked up to the front door, I paused for a moment. The house looked just as it always had, quiet and still. I took a deep breath and entered. As I closed the door behind me, I heard a faint rustling sound coming from the living room. I stood frozen in place, my heart racing. Slowly I turned toward the noise. To my shock, the letter was sitting on the couch, opened this time. A third message was written on the back. I'm inside. In that moment, I realized I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been in my house. But the question was who and why? Story 26. I was in the middle of my usual morning routine, sipping my coffee and preparing for the day ahead. The sun had just risen, casting a soft glow over the quiet neighborhood. As I stood by the window, I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. In the middle of my front yard, nestled among the grass, was a small toy. At first, I thought it was a neighbor's child who had accidentally dropped it, but there was no sign of any kids playing nearby. The closest house had no children, and the yard was empty. I felt a strange unease settle in my chest. I put my coffee down and went outside to investigate, my heart beating a little faster than usual. The toy was a small, colorful plastic car, worn at the edges as if it had been used often. There was no logical explanation for its presence. I didn't have children, and no one in my neighborhood had young kids either. It seemed almost as though it had appeared out of nowhere. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, hoping for some clue, some sign that could explain how it ended up in my yard. But there was nothing. No name, no markings, just a plain toy car. The feeling of unease deepened, gnawing at me. I glanced around, checking to see if anyone was watching me, but the street was eerily quiet. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves on the trees. I stood there for a moment, holding the toy, unsure of what to do. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Could someone have left it there on purpose? Maybe it was a prank, but it didn't feel like one. It felt too deliberate, too strange. I thought about walking over to the neighbors' houses to ask if any children had been around, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the answer would be unsettling. I walked back inside, the toy still in my hand, and set it on the kitchen counter. I tried to go about my day, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. I checked the toy every few minutes, as if hoping it would reveal something new, some clue that would explain its sudden appearance. But nothing changed. The toy remained just as it was, an unremarkable object that seemed to have no business being in my yard. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a noise outside. It was faint, like the soft scraping of something against the ground. My heart jumped, and I sat up, straining to listen. The noise stopped as quickly as it had started. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, kept me awake. I kept imagining the toy sitting on my counter, its empty, lifeless presence adding to the growing sense of dread. The next morning I woke up early and decided to take a walk around the yard. I had to know if the toy was still there. When I stepped outside, my breath caught in my throat. The toy car was gone. In its place was a small, plastic doll. It was the same size as the car, but this time it was a girl, with blonde hair and a pink dress. I didn't know what to think. I hadn't seen anyone near my house in the last 24 hours. And yet here it was, another toy placed neatly in the yard. I bent down and picked it up, my hands trembling. The same sense of wrongness filled me, a deep, unsettling feeling that I couldn't shake. I looked around again, hoping to catch a glimpse of anyone who might be responsible. But once again, the street was empty. There was no one in sight. I walked around the yard, inspecting every corner, every patch of grass, but found no other signs of life. It was as if the toys had appeared out of thin air, left there by some unseen hand. I considered calling the police, but I didn't have anything concrete to report. A couple of toys showing up in my yard didn't exactly seem like a crime, even if it was making me uneasy. Over the next few days, things only got stranger. More toys appeared, one each day, always at the same spot in the yard. A stuffed bear one morning, a small ball the next, and then a toy truck. Each toy was different, but each was a child's toy, seemingly random but carefully placed. I started to keep track of them in a notebook, hoping that if I could find a pattern, it might explain what was happening. But no matter how much I analyzed the situation, nothing made sense. There were no children around, and no one seemed to know anything about the toys. It was as if they were being left there on purpose, but for what reason? One evening, as I sat in my living room, I thought I heard a faint laugh from outside. It was distant, almost like it was coming from a child, but there was no one around. My heart raced as I stood up and walked toward the window. I peered outside, my pulse quickening. For a moment I saw nothing, just the familiar sight of my quiet yard. Then I spotted another toy sitting in the grass. This time it was a small wooden horse, carved with intricate detail. But what made my stomach drop was the note tucked beneath it. I rushed outside and grabbed it, my hands shaking as I unfolded the paper. It simply read, "You're next." A chill ran down my spine. I stared at the words, the feeling of dread building in my chest. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or was someone really watching me, planning something sinister? I immediately looked around, but the street was still empty. No one was in sight, no cars driving by, no pedestrians walking. It was just me standing there, holding a note that felt more like a warning than anything else. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was happening, and I needed to find out what. I began to pay even closer attention to my surroundings. I started setting up cameras around my property, hoping to catch whoever was leaving the toys. But no matter how many times I checked the footage, I never saw anyone. The toys just seemed to appear out of nowhere, each one a new piece in a puzzle I couldn't solve. Days turned into weeks, and the toys continued to appear. Each one was different, each one accompanied by a note, each one leaving me more unsettled than the last. I started to feel like I was losing my mind, like I was the target of some elaborate prank or worse, something far darker. But the toys didn't stop, and neither did the messages. Then, one night, after I had received the latest toy and note, I decided to sit outside, waiting, hoping to finally catch whoever was behind it all. I didn't know how long I'd been sitting there when I finally heard the faint rustling of footsteps on the grass. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding. There, at the edge of the yard, stood a figure. A tall man, his face obscured by the shadows. He stood there for a moment, just watching me, and then he disappeared into the darkness. I ran inside, my heart racing, and locked the door behind me. That was the moment I knew. Whoever had been leaving the toys, whoever had been watching me, was no longer content with just playing games. I was the next piece in whatever twisted plan they had in mind, and I had no idea what would happen next. Story 27. I heard loud knocking on my door, but no one was there when I checked. It was a cold evening, and the house was quiet. I had just finished dinner, sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard 3 firm knocks on my front door. It wasn't the usual gentle tap of a neighbor or delivery person. This was aggressive, forceful, like someone was impatient and trying to get my attention. My heart skipped a beat as I stood up, walking cautiously toward the door. I glanced through the peephole but saw nothing but the dimly lit porch. No one was standing there. My first thought was that it was some kind of prank, maybe a neighbor playing a joke. But when I opened the door to check, the porch was empty. No one was around, no footsteps in the snow, no car in sight. The silence was unsettling, like the knock had never happened at all. I shut the door and locked it, but the feeling of unease lingered. For the next few hours, I tried to shake off the incident. I told myself it was probably just a neighbor who knocked and quickly left. Maybe they had knocked at the wrong house, or maybe they were just being strange for some unknown reason. But deep down, something about it didn't sit right. The knocks had felt too deliberate, too forceful. As the night wore on, I found myself repeatedly checking the locks on the doors and windows, feeling a growing sense of dread. It wasn't until later that night, just as I was about to fall asleep, that I heard it again. 3 more loud knocks, this time coming from the back door. My breath caught in my throat. There was no way it was a coincidence. The knocks were too deliberate, too insistent. I crept out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I slowly made my way toward the kitchen, where the back door led to the small patio. My mind raced, trying to figure out who or what could be doing this. I reached the back door and peeked through the blinds. Again, no one was there, just the quiet, empty yard stretching out in the dim moonlight. I opened the door cautiously, stepping outside to scan the area. There was nothing, not even a sign that someone had been there recently. I checked the gate to the backyard, locked, just like it should be. The feeling of being watched crept over me, but I couldn't explain why. It didn't make sense. Why would someone knock and then vanish without a trace? I decided to call the police, but they assured me it was probably just someone messing around and that I should be cautious. They recommended that I check my cameras, which I didn't have, and then said to call back if anything strange happened again. As I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of frustration and fear. I wanted answers, but I wasn't sure where to start. Whoever was doing this knew exactly when I was home, and it felt too targeted to be a random act of mischief. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but the knocking continued. Every few hours I would hear it again, 3 loud knocks on the door. Sometimes the front, sometimes the back. Every time I checked, there was no one there. I felt like I was going insane. Who could be doing this? Was someone watching me, waiting for me to open the door? It didn't help that the knocks always came when the house was at its quietest, right when I started to relax. I began to wonder if the knocks had a deeper meaning, some kind of message that I wasn't understanding. Over the next few days, the knocks grew more frequent and my paranoia grew with them. I started to lock myself in at night, leaving all the lights on and the blinds shut. But no matter how secure I felt, the knocking always found its way back to me. I had stopped answering the door, but the sound of it haunted me, echoing through my thoughts even when I wasn't at home. I tried asking my neighbors if they'd heard anything strange, but they all seemed as clueless as I was. No one else had experienced the knocks, and they all thought I was overreacting. Then, one afternoon, the knocking stopped. It was almost as if it had never happened at all. I went about my day, cautiously hopeful that it was finally over. But a week later, I found something that made my blood run cold. I was cleaning the front door when I noticed something strange on the door frame, a faint scratch, almost like something had been scraped across it. It was subtle, barely visible at first, but upon closer inspection, I realized it was a symbol. A small circular mark etched into the wood. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't recognize the symbol, and I couldn't figure out what it meant. I ran my fingers over it, trying to wipe it away, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the mark had been carved into the door with intent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that the knocking had stopped. But something else was happening. Whoever had been knocking wasn't done with me. They were leaving their mark. As the days went on, the knocking didn't return, but the symbol on the door remained. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the fact that someone had been coming to my house, knocking without leaving a trace. The fact that the symbol was there, as if it had been placed deliberately, only added to the growing sense of dread. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. I don't know who was behind the knocks, or what they wanted, but I do know one thing: I will never forget that eerie sound. The sound of someone knocking on my door, only to vanish without a trace. And now, every time I hear a knock, I can't help but wonder, is it them again, coming back to finish what they started? Story 28. I had just gotten back from a long day at work. The drive home was uneventful, with the usual stop-and-go traffic and the hum of the engine filling the car. I parked my car in the driveway, grabbed my things and headed inside, trying to shake off the exhaustion that weighed heavily on me. I didn't think much of it until I sat down in the living room to relax. That's when I realized something was off. I didn't usually think about my rearview mirror. It was just something I adjusted at the start of the day and rarely touched after that. But as I sat there, a strange feeling of unease crept over me. Something was nagging at me, like a thought I couldn't quite grasp. Without thinking, I stood up and walked back to the car, a sense of dread growing with each step. I opened the driver's side door, and the first thing I noticed was the rearview mirror. It was angled completely differently from how I had left it. I always adjusted it so I could see the cars behind me clearly, in a way that felt natural, but now it was tilted downward, the reflection showing only the dashboard and the steering wheel, as if someone had deliberately moved it into an awkward position. I stared at the mirror, feeling a chill creep up my spine. There was no reason for the mirror to be adjusted like that. No one else had driven my car, and I was sure I hadn't touched it. I never changed it once I got it set right. I reached up to fix it, but as my hand hovered near the mirror, I stopped. The thought occurred to me, what if someone had been in my car without me knowing? The idea made my stomach twist. The mirror didn't just shift by accident. It felt intentional. I quickly checked the rest of the car, my eyes darting from the seats to the floorboards, half expecting to find something out of place. But everything seemed normal. No signs of forced entry, no clutter, nothing unusual. Yet the feeling in the pit of my stomach refused to go away. Someone had been in my car. I couldn't shake the thought, even as I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a mistake, a simple error in how the mirror had been left. But deep down, I couldn't convince myself that it was that simple. That night I locked all the doors and windows in the house, double-checking every single one, but I couldn't get the image of the tilted mirror out of my mind. I tossed and turned in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling more and more unsettled. Every little noise outside made me jump, every creak of the house amplified in the silence of the night. My mind kept returning to the car, to that mirror. Why would someone move it like that? What were they trying to see? The next morning I decided to do a thorough check of the car again. I couldn't let it go. I searched every nook and cranny, from the glove compartment to the back seat, even checking the trunk. Everything seemed untouched, but the odd feeling lingered. I drove to work, trying to focus, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was missing something, like there was a bigger picture I wasn't seeing. That night, after returning home from work, I went to the car once more. I was determined to figure out what had happened. As I approached the driver's side, I hesitated for a moment before opening the door. The car sat there, silent and still, but I could feel the tension building in my chest. I opened the door and looked inside. The mirror was still in the same position, still angled down. But this time I noticed something else. On the passenger side, the door handle looked slightly scuffed, as if someone had touched it recently. I froze. It was such a small detail, but it was enough to send my mind racing. Why would someone touch the passenger door handle? I was sure I hadn't used it since I parked the car. My thoughts spiraled out of control. Had someone been sitting in the passenger seat? Or worse, had they been watching me? I didn't know what to think anymore. The next day, I decided to take my car to a mechanic, just to see if there was anything unusual. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the mirror had simply loosened or something had shifted while I was driving. I didn't know. But when I explained the situation to the mechanic, he raised an eyebrow and seemed just as puzzled as I was. After inspecting the car, he told me that everything seemed fine. The mirror was securely in place, and there was no sign of tampering or anything out of the ordinary. I left the garage feeling more confused than ever. I wanted so badly to believe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Someone had been in my car, but who and why? Days passed, but the unease never left. I kept checking the mirror, checking the car, always on edge, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No more strange occurrences, no signs of anyone tampering with the car. The feeling of being watched slowly faded, but it never completely went away. I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was all just a fluke, or maybe someone was watching me from afar, leaving me with nothing but a cryptic sign. I still drive that same car every day, but I can never bring myself to adjust the rearview mirror again. I leave it where it is now, just in case. Story 29. Someone left a trail of pennies leading to my front door. I first noticed them when I went out to grab the mail. At the edge of my driveway, there was a single penny lying on the ground. I didn't think much of it at first, thinking it was just a random coin someone had dropped. But as I walked closer to the front porch, I saw another penny, then another and another, each one placed carefully in a straight line leading directly to my doorstep. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the trail. It wasn't just a few coins scattered around. The pennies were spaced out, almost too perfectly, like they had been intentionally placed there. My heart started to race as I bent down to pick one up. The date on the coin was recent, no older than a few years, and there was no visible wear or dirt on it. The thought that someone had spent time carefully arranging these coins on my property made my skin crawl. I stepped inside quickly, locking the door behind me. I looked out through the curtains, scanning the street for any signs of who might have done this. But the street was empty, the usual calm of the neighborhood unsettling in contrast to the unease I felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I checked my phone, half expecting to see a message or a call, but there was nothing. It didn't make sense. Why would someone leave a trail of pennies leading to my door? The next few days were filled with this same strange occurrence. Each morning I would find more pennies, each one leading to the same spot, my front door. It was as if they appeared overnight, placed carefully along the path. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That someone was leaving pennies outside my door. It didn't seem like a crime, just an odd, unsettling thing that I couldn't explain. By the fourth day, the trail of pennies had grown even longer. It now stretched from the end of my driveway all the way to the sidewalk, and it seemed like the number of coins was increasing. It felt like a countdown, like the pennies were building up to something. The weight of it, the feeling that there was some purpose to this strange ritual, gnawed at me. I started to feel paranoid. I couldn't help but think that the person who was doing this was waiting for something, waiting for me to notice. Each time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched, like the air around me was charged with tension. But when I checked, the street was always empty. There was no one in sight. No sign of any suspicious activity. It was just me, the pennies, and the increasing dread that seemed to follow me everywhere. On the sixth day, I decided to take action. I went to the local store, bought a large jar, and started collecting the pennies. I was done with the strange trail. I didn't care who was doing it or why they weren't going to keep messing with me. But when I picked up the last penny at the end of the trail, I found something that made my blood run cold. Underneath the coin was a small, folded note, its edges worn as if it had been sitting there for days. I opened it carefully, not sure what to expect. The note read, "You're next." I froze. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was reading. Who could have left this? Why now? The message wasn't signed, no hint of who it could be from, but it didn't need a signature. The words were enough to make my heart race, to fill me with the fear that something was coming, something I wasn't prepared for. The pennies had been a warning, a prelude to something darker. I ran inside, locked the door, and checked every window. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. I didn't know what else to do. This wasn't just a prank anymore, it felt like a threat. The coins, the note, it all pointed to something more sinister. But as I spoke to the dispatcher, explaining what had happened, I felt a strange sense of hopelessness. How could I explain this to them? How could I tell them that someone had been leaving pennies at my door for days without sounding insane? The police arrived shortly after, taking the note and examining the coins, but there was nothing they could do. They told me that it was probably just a prank, that people sometimes do strange things for no reason. But I knew better. It wasn't just a prank. There was a purpose behind it, and whatever that purpose was, it was aimed at me. The trail of pennies stopped after that day, but the fear didn't. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching, waiting. The pennies had been left as a warning, a message I couldn't fully understand, I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: whoever had been leaving the pennies wasn't done with me yet. The note had made that clear. Story 30. I found a note under my pillow that said, "You're too late." The words were written in a hurried, jagged scrawl, the ink smeared in places as if the person had been writing quickly, desperately. I blinked, confused, trying to make sense of it. I had been living alone for months, no visitors, no friends dropping by. I hadn't told anyone where I kept my spare key or where my most personal items were. The note didn't make sense. I turned it over, expecting to see a signature or more words, something that would explain what this cryptic message meant. But there was nothing. Just a blank back, as if the note had been hastily written, dropped, and forgotten about. I felt my heart start to race. I had no idea who could have written it or how it had ended up under my pillow. I always checked my room before I went to bed, locked the windows, and made sure everything was in place. This note was something I couldn't explain. I stared at the note for a while, trying to stay calm. Could someone have broken in while I was asleep? But nothing was disturbed. My things were in their usual places. The room was locked when I woke up. I hadn't heard anything unusual during the night. The idea that someone could have snuck in without me noticing seemed impossible. Yet the note was right there, in front of me, undeniable. I started to wonder if it was some sort of joke. Maybe one of my friends was playing a prank on me, though it seemed strange that they would be able to get in without me noticing. I pulled my phone from the bedside table and sent a message to a few of my closest friends, asking if any of them had been in my apartment. The replies came quickly. All of them said no, none had been anywhere near my place. My anxiety deepened. How could the note have gotten there if it wasn't someone I knew? I couldn't shake the words. You're too late. Too late for what? I had been careful, vigilant even. I had always felt safe in my home. The note made me feel like something was wrong, like something had been happening just outside my awareness. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe I had been ignoring the signs, the small things I didn't want to notice, the little hints that something was off. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. What if someone had been watching me? I started to feel paranoid, jumping at every noise, every small movement. I checked the locks on my doors again, making sure everything was secure. Still, the feeling of dread lingered, the words of the note echoing in my mind. You're too late. Wait. I spent the rest of the day distracted, unable to focus on anything. My thoughts kept returning to the note. Was it a warning? Or had I somehow missed something important, something I should have noticed? I checked my apartment again, this time more thoroughly. I looked in places I wouldn't normally look, under furniture, in the back of closets. Nothing. Everything seemed fine, but the uneasy feeling never left. That night, I locked the doors, checked the windows, and made sure my phone was charged. I set an alarm. Not that I thought anything would happen, but just in case. The sense of being watched never faded. I tried to get some sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the note again. You're too late. In the morning, I decided I had to do something. I called the police, explained the situation, and asked if they could help me make sense of what had happened. They were polite but not overly concerned. They said it was probably just a prank, that it was unlikely anyone had been inside my apartment. Still, they promised to send someone over to check. The officer arrived later in the day, and after a brief inspection, he agreed with what I had feared. There was no sign of a break-in, no forced entry. But that didn't explain the note. He advised me to be more careful, to keep the windows locked and my doors secure. I nodded, but I didn't feel reassured. As the officer left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off, that there was more to the note than I was seeing. Days passed, but the unease never left me. I stayed home more often, didn't leave my apartment unless I absolutely had to. The note had planted a seed of fear in me, a fear I couldn't shake. I kept waiting for something to happen, for a phone call, a knock on the door, anything. The words "you're too late" hung over me like a cloud. Then, one evening, while I was sitting on the couch, I heard a soft noise outside my door. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe something falling, but then it came again, a tap, faint but deliberate. My pulse quickened. I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart raced as I got up and approached the door, hesitating for a moment before peering through the peephole. There was no one there. Confused, I slowly opened the door, stepping cautiously into the hallway. Nothing. No sign of anyone, no one in sight. But then, I saw something. At the far end of the hall, tucked just behind the corner, was a small envelope. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. I picked it up, hands shaking, and walked back into my apartment. I opened the envelope slowly, already dreading what I might find. Inside was a small slip of paper. It was the same handwriting, the same jagged scrawl. This time the note read, "You're not alone." My heart raced. This couldn't be happening. I had already felt like something was wrong, like I wasn't safe. But now it was clear. Someone was out there watching me, leaving these cryptic messages, and I had no idea who or why. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. But as I turned to look around my apartment, feeling more terrified than ever before, I realized the truth: I wasn't alone. The shadows in the corners of the room, the cold drafts of air, I wasn't alone at all. The person who had left the note, who had been watching me, was already inside.